Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, we're back with another review of another recently finished Survivor season. Now, again, obviously apologize for this being a bit late, but here I'll finally get around to reviewing Survivor Australia versus the World. Obviously, this long talked about global showdown of Survivor that, for the most part, I do think lived up to expectations. I do feel like, for the most part, this was a very solid season. Obviously, seeing a lot of these legends of the show coming together and playing what was a very interesting game for a decent chunk of it, though I do think, at the end of the day, the season still falls into a lot of the Australian Survivor failings, particularly from the editing perspective, while also having a pretty stagnant endgame that was not the most riveting TV, though I do think the strengths of this season really do come from the fact that, again, we obviously had these like big legends of the game coming together and playing fairly actively until the tail end of it. Anyway, again, I will be running through the season from beginning to end, talking about my opinions on it along the way, like I do with every other review. So with that, let's start off with episode 1, where we get a pretty epic introduction here, one that did feel very fitting of this global showdown that we were getting. We're starting it off with text on the screen saying Australian survivors produce some of the greatest players, and it's time for them to take on the world, which I will say, why was this not narrated by JLP? Like, that was very strange, and I don't know if they made this decision to add this in here after JLP's firing. And with that, again, I guess I should mention the fact that this is JLP's last season. Again, this is his last season as host. Obviously, since then, he has been fired, which is obviously a massive shame, considering I do think JLP has really been coming into his own. I actually, for a while, did not particularly like JLP as a host. I do feel like for his first few years, he really just did not do much for me, though I do think in more recent years he's really just excelled in his role, and I think for him to actually be just taken out of that position just feels like a shame, though I think he went out on a pretty good note here. Again, I do think his final season here is one where I did like a lot of his interactions with most of the players here. He still got his quippy one-liners here and there, that he still got his ball innuendos in there, and again, it just feels like JLP just kind of got the most of his final season here, though again, it's kind of a shame that it is his final season. But again, this intro does lead to us getting introduced to each player one by one, which again is a very fitting way of doing a season like this, especially with a smaller cast, which would allow them to do something like this, where obviously it would be very difficult, 24 people. And with that, I guess I should mention the fact that this season is only 14 people and only 16 days, which is, again, just kind of lame. Now, again, I get it. The fact that, again, you can't really get a lot of these big legends of the game to agree to do more than like a couple weeks. Again, had this been a normal Australian Survivor season, they simply just would not do it. For the 16 days aspect of it, I actually am not as bothered by. It's more so the fact that this cast is only 14 people. I feel like that's just a very strange number. And I know there were rumors out there that it was meant to be 16 at a point until some last second cuts. But again, it's still a spot here where I think they should have at least gone 16. I mean, 16 is the smallest number of people we've seen play something like Survivor US. And beyond that, also not having that at least is kind of weird gender breakdown on the cast. And in general, it just feels like a spot where, again, I think it would have been better if this was 16 people, even though, again, it is lame that it's only 16 days. That's not the most bothersome aspect of the season for me. It's more so the smaller amount of people that makes us feel a bit smaller scaled of a season, despite the fact that obviously you have these big legends of the game. Where, in many ways, I do look at this more so as an exhibition match than like a true-on season, where it does very much bother me the fact that they are considering this the official season 11 of Australian Survivor, where to me, again, it just really does not feel like a full season. It really just should be a spin-off in my mind. Obviously, it's just a radically different game, being a third of the length and almost half the amount of people, to where, again, for this season to be considered part of like the full-on canon of the rest of the series just feels like a weird dynamic to me. Anyway, we get to the player introductions. First, with a plane trying to land and there being a person on the runway that turns out to be Shawnee, with this being a pretty grand entrance here for Shawnee here, who obviously at this point is the Australian Survivor that's played the most. This is her 4th time appearing, and also through that, the person that's played the most days. And again, she gets a great introduction here. Again, her theme song playing, her talking about how she came on maternity leave for this. What would a global showdown be without me? And that she needs to get paid, where again, all this very fun Shawnee content in a spot where I do find it a bit strange by the end, the fact that she is given such a grand entrance for what ends up being a fairly subdued edit by the end. I actually feel like Shawnee's run on this season ended up coming off very disappointing to me, especially considering the fact that, again, she was the first introduced here. It very much screamed out to me that she was going to be one of the major characters of the season, only for edit to kind of just die off after a few episodes. And obviously Shawnee had to be a no-brainer here. Again, there was no way they were going to do this season and not ask Shawnee. Again, it is kind of mind-blowing that she's played 4 times out of 11 seasons, but it's still a spot where, again, it makes a lot of sense for them to actually go Shawnee in this spot. But beyond that, we then get to Luke, who gets introduced by breaking out of a luggage bag for some reason. But again, he obviously says, the king of the jungle is back, baby. And he says there's a long list of things he hasn't been seen doing, and one of them's win, and we certainly won't see that again this time. But Luke is someone that I know for a while had been saying that he didn't want to play Survivor again, so for him to finally show up here again was a little shocking, and considering his activities outside the show, I wasn't particularly excited for it. I was not looking forward to seeing Luke back on my TV screen, but again, he's here and he does the same shtick. Following that, we get to what ends up being one of the more abbreviated introductions here, with us seeing Sarah and Kirby getting out of the plane, them calling Sarah a devious mastermind. Guess, I don't know when she was really a mastermind. Only then to proceed to get no confessional in this entire premiere episode, which is very funny, especially considering she ends up actually becoming one of the major characters after this premiere episode. But again, that's Australian Survivor for you. Only then get focus on Kirby, with her being called a strategic rebel and a rebel queen who wants to make every vote a blindside, which ends up being a fun introduction for her in a spot where, again, exciting to see Kirby back. A spot where Kirby is the most recent Australian Survivor player to be on this cast, and while maybe a bit of a surprise they didn't go for Ferris alongside her, I did actually find this to be a very strong appearance from Kirby here, even though, again, she kind of falters at the end. Though I should mention the fact that I was excited to see Sarah back here. I mean, Sarah is someone that just has not been back on another season, kind of inexplicitly. I assume it was probably a spot where she didn't want to do a full-on 50-day season, but her actually being chosen for A vs. the World here, again, is a little surprising, though also a kind of inspired choice that, again, I think kind of works out by the end. Then we get introduced to Janine, who's obviously the godmother, saying that she can wheel and deal like the best of them, with Janine also being a bit of a surprising pick here. Now, Janine, obviously, again, is a massive name in Australia, one of the most successful businesswomen there, and the fact that they would want someone like Janine is not particularly shocking, and the fact that, again, she has said no in the past to, 50-day seasons, and again, this being a short one, obviously gave her more incentive to say yes to her. It's not necessarily shocking that she said yes to this and that they would want her, but just someone that wasn't really on my radar coming into the season of being on this season. But following that, we then get introduced to the Mad King, with George being stopped by security at the airport and then pulling out a massive crown and him giving this really over-the-top face, with this being such a bizarre intro there. But it also leads to him talking about how he's grown a lot since the last time, and his ass has doubled in size, and he's coming in hot with this dad bod, which, again, typical George stuff. But again, George kind of obvious to be here. Again, what would a global showdown be without George? But again, with that, George was obviously one of the bigger locks to be on the board here. And then we get to the final player on the Australia tribe, with this being the Golden God, David, coming right off of winning an obscene amount of money on Deal or No Deal Island, having filmed, again, just right before this and I know there are stories about David supposedly being a last-second addition to the cast, that he was not added until fairly late into the process, which does lead to a lot of people being surprised that he's there, to where it does seem like it was possibly his connection to Parvati, and knowing that she was going to be on, that potentially convinced him to be on. But again, David's someone that kind of a no-brainer. You kind of had to have him here if he wanted to be here. Now, it is a bit shocking that he is the only winner on the Australia tribe. Again, in a global showdown, you would expect more of the winners on the board, again, more of the best, but David being here, again, makes a lot of sense. And we obviously have him really talking up his game, talking about he played the perfect game, and the only way he was going to come back was to represent his country, and then does his typical shtick of saying the Golden God is back in a spot where he very clearly sounds sick, which I did find kind of funny. But either way, he ends up driving a truck with the Australian flag to end up picking up the other Australians. I will say, despite the fact that David was supposedly a last-second addition for this cast, it does very much feel like a tribe kind of built for David. This is a tribe where David just has so many connections. He obviously has Luke and Janine, who he has previously played with. He has Sarah, who is someone that he had known before playing Survivor. He has at least played with Shawnee. Mind you, they don't have a good relationship, but again, that's at least a connection there. Oh, again, Luke, his ride or die, has a connection to Kirby. It really just feels like a spot where he has all these connections on this season, to where it is kind of just mind-blowing that he ends up being the first boot from this tribe despite that. But obviously, it's at this point where we then get introduced to the toughest opponents yet, the world, with them now driving in on trucks, with Tony on top of the U.S. truck. I love Joe P saying the U.S., where it all began, which is like, kind of, I mean, if we're going by the Survivor name, yeah, but again, if we're going by just the concept of the show, no. But either way, Tony gets introduced here, obviously two-time winner. Great get for this season. If you're going for the biggest names, which it does feel like that was their intention with the World Tribe, at least from the series of note, again, Tony just feels like such an easy person to get here. Then we cut to the other two U.S. players, with us seeing Parvati driving the truck and Suri in the passenger seat, which, I mean, felt very reminiscent of how they end up being edited, where we end up getting no confessional from Suri in this intro, her, again, alongside Sarah being the two people to not get properly introduced. Oh, well, Parvati obviously takes the forefront here, having her very cringy confessional saying sweet little Aussies think they know how to play Survivor in like a baby voice, which is very weird. And talks about how she's been playing Survivor for decades, which is a confessional they keep on using on the season. And also talks about how she won once, but should have been twice. And last time in Samoa, she lost due to a bitter jury, and it's time for her to claim her win that was meant to be hers. Where this is again a line that gets used over and over again on the season, where it's very obvious Parvati's winning this season. And straight up, I was spoiled on this season, and many of the spoilers that were out there turned out to be correct. Now, not 100%, but again, the winner was correct. And a lot of the boot list was correct, to where I did come into the season being spoiled that Parvati did end up winning the season. But even if I was not spoiled, I feel like this would still be a very apparent outcome, especially by the mid portion of the season, where by that point it really just felt like there was no other feasible option. To where I think that is something that I'm still a bit conflicted on my opinions of the season. The fact that I do feel like this is a season that, while Parvati winning obviously is a very satisfying story in terms of her reopening this conversation of is she the greatest of all time and having more of an argument for it, but at the same time it led to the back portion of the season just kind of being a bit boring, where it was just kind of obvious that Parvati's going to win, and there was no real doubt in that. To where overall, again, I am very happy that Parvati won this season. I do feel like it is, again, a very fitting ending to a global showdown. Yet again, to me, it's just another issue of Australian Survivor's editing, that they kind of just made the winner a bit too obvious from how it was edited. But along with that, obviously having Parvati in the game here with Sri is obviously, again, pretty powerful for her, and number one ride or die ally that will never turn on her. And to fair, same thing goes with Sri as well. But it's a spot here where obviously that's something that was very good for Parvati's game, though at the same time, coming into this season with only 3 US players on a 7-person tribe obviously should be an initial disadvantage, though at the same time also she's someone that's known for running a girls alliance on a tribe that has majority women that also have women that are fans of hers, where again it's kind of this thing of that I do think Parvati came into this game in a fairly good position, but she obviously ends up making the most of it and plays an extremely dominant game by the end. But then it's said that they're joined by the best the world has to offer, with us now getting introduced to the other internationals, us getting introduced to Cass from Survivor Quebec Season 2 as a deadly triple threat, which she proceeds to say in French, I'm gonna vote your butt off. And Cass is someone that I had watched her original season when it was airing, which obviously was originally aired in French, though with subtitles. And Cass is someone that, coming into this season, I was kind of just fine with. I feel like she was a very competent all-around player on that season, just a bit too loyal. And I actually do feel like I come out of this season having kind of a higher opinion of her. I actually do feel like she was an interesting presence on the season despite being under-edited, and ended up playing a fairly interesting game. For a while, kind of a fairly random pick here. Again, to get a runner-up from Survivor Quebec, I did find her casting here to be pretty inspired. Then we cut to a strategic assassin, and that being Lisa, the winner of Survivor New Zealand Thailand, with us getting a very funny confessional from her, talking about how she's the one and forever reigning champion of Survivor NZ, because it got canceled. And again, Lisa's someone that I was very excited to see here. I mean, Lisa's someone that I know is a massive super fan of the show, literally won the show in an RHAP t-shirt, and played a fairly impressive game her first time around, where again, seeing her play again, get more information on her as a player, and also see her interact with some of the best, Suri in particular, I thought was fairly fascinating here. Again, weirdly, Lisa being like one of the few like diehard super fans on a cast of Global Survivor, where you would think that you'd want more people that actually know who the other people are, but either way. Then we cut to a Nordic wolf, Tommy, from Survivor Finland Season 7, driving a motorcycle on his own, where he talks about how no one knows this guy from Finland. You're going to be surprised that I have game, where I don't know how much we necessarily see him have game on the season. Though, again, Tommy's also someone that I did watch his original season. Mind you, in preparation for this, it's not like Cass, where like I just naturally watched her season as it was airing. And Tommy was someone that I thought was a pretty interesting player his first time around, played a fairly dominant game, very strategically minded. And I feel like on his appearance here, I feel like I kind of had the opposite opinion of Cass. Not necessarily I played poorly, considering he obviously had a lot of things being stacked against him, but it felt like a game where he was not really given the opportunity to really do much to really prop him up as a player. It really feels like he was just kind of on the bottom for a lot of the season. Never had any true power yet. Despite that, I thought he was a pretty fun presence here. And I think, again, if you're going to get somebody from one of these European versions of Survivor, I think Tommy is someone that does feel like a pretty solid pick, considering that. But then we cut to the final person on the World Tribe, that being Rob Bentley, who's fist pumping at the top of the truck, being called a charming puppet master, and him clearly getting a villain edit from the very beginning here, saying that his eyes hypnotize. And are dangerous the longer you're around me. Saying that he's going to bring balance to Survivor, where you have the Australians calling themselves gods and kings, and he's here to give them a long overdue devil of a thrashing. Compliments of Africa, which I will say is an insane confessional. I think this is actually quite possibly one of my favorite confessionals of all time. That being said, it's very clearly setting him up for a fall. It feels like content very much setting him up for being very overconfident in a game, where not shocking at all from an edit perspective. He ends up being the first boot here, even though, again, it's mind-blowing someone like Rob Bentley would be a first boot. But again, the casting of Rob Bentley here was just kind of obvious. I think if you were to get one Survivor SA player, again, getting Rob Bentley play Australian Survivor just makes a lot of sense. Again, someone that is extremely physical, someone that is a very strong all-around player, and again, probably one of the most dominant winners in the history of the show, where, again, having him here on the World Tribe just kind of makes a lot of sense. So again, looking at the cast, it really is an insane grouping of players. Again, while the AU Tribe is one that maybe could be a little bit more stacked, especially considering the options they could have potentially had, I do feel like the World Tribe, if you specifically wanted to get the breakdown that we had, I do feel like it ends up being a fairly solid grouping by the end here. But then we get to the first reward challenge, with the tribes finally meeting, was seeing people like Sarah being excited to see Parvati and George being excited to see Sari. But we also get the typical Matt chat here, with JLP doing very clear exposition for the audience, talking about how Shawnee's played a lot of Survivor, but not as much as Parvati, and talking about how there's 4 winners on the other side, and Tony won twice, so technically 5 winners, and also calls out Sari for being the best player to never win, where, again, a lot of this just felt like it was for the Australian audience who have not seen any of these people. But I do love what this leads to Kirby just admitting the fact that she doesn't know who any of these people are, which I actually do think in general, I think probably plays a factor into this season. I think with a lot of these world players, obviously not everyone was able to do their research on them, where, again, with you being on their show that's Australia versus the world, it's very easy to research Australian Survivor and get to know the players that are going to be on the other tribe. But when it comes to the world, you really have no real idea of what shows these people are going to be coming from outside of, I guess, Survivor US. But it does lead to a lot of these world players not even knowing each other, and even the Australian tribe here is a tribe not really consisting of many fans. So I do think the lack of knowledge between the players made this a bit different from a typical returnee season. I do think some people did not have the correct threat levels associated with them. And I think some people were just kind of aloof to certain connections that certain players had, particularly the Parvati Suri one that I think may have helped their positioning here. But either way, we do get to the challenge itself, which has them sliding down a slide, then crawl into their net, and then throw a bag to hit a bell with the first person to do that, getting to pick an item from a shelf comprising of basic supplies, along with comfort, coffee, champagne, and also a mystery box that everyone clearly knows is an advantage. But this ends up being a fine challenge, giving us the 1v1 matchups without having any true physicality to it, which again, you wouldn't really expect them to do these big wrestling style challenges with these big legends of the game. But we do end up seeing David and Rob being the first go. JLP obviously having to make this statement about how there's lots of beef up there, and Parvati say grade A, which I found very cringy. But Rob ends up winning this pretty quick, and obviously ends up picking the mystery box. So there's a spot here where we do see David already giving Rob a proposition, saying that he wants him in the endgame, and that saying that if you go, I go, to where they end up making a deal here to give each other input on who goes from the other tribe. And in general, again, this was really surreal to see. I mean, first up, again, 2 of the best winners in the history of the show, and David and Rob Bentley interacting, but also the fact that they're making these, again, right off the bat, again, literally at this first reward challenge here, which I think is fairly unprecedented. Again, seeing this was just so surreal to see, though also just kind of see through, as everyone kind of knew that Rob and David were talking and knew they were going to be working together, which I think definitely played a factor into how Rob's game later progresses. But finally, we end up seeing George surprisingly beating Tommy here after talking about how terrible at sports he is, which was kind of humorous, though at the same time, we do see George getting really mocked here for him wearing this Australian Speedo. And in general, George ends up being this very weird figure on this season, where despite the fact that he was this mastermind figure for his last 2 appearances, on this season, he's fully just portrayed as a joke. And to be fair, his game on this season is pretty representative of that, but still a very weird shakeup in how George was perceived here. But then we get to see Kirby versus Parvati. Parvati flirtily saying, I'm not scared of Kirby, which again, this flirting might come up again down the road, all while we end up seeing Luke be paired up with Tony, which again is pretty surreal because I know Luke was someone that the only thing he had seen before going on Survivor was a compilation of Tony moments, to where it's interesting to see those two. Oh, we see Suri facing off against Sarah, and Cass ending up beating Janine, to where we get the final matchup here of it being Lisa versus Shawnee, with the last prize on the board being champagne, which is obviously very important to have on day one of Survivor. But Lisa ends up surprisingly winning this and gets a hug from Suri, which probably made her entire life. We finally get around to going back to the camps, where we do start off with the World Tribe, with Parvati getting the initial content here, as you would expect. Despite the fact that it's actually Suri that's like leading the introductions here, where again, it's very funny that we see Suri like introducing herself and leading to everyone else introducing themselves, only for Parvati to be the one that's talking over all this. But again, we instantly see this 4 versus 3 split here, with the 3 US players in the minority trying to stick together until the merge. Though we see Parvati being worried about Tony as he's a loose cannon, but Suri is her girl. And we obviously have to show the Eric blindside to remind us of that. Though again, it obviously was very surreal to see Parvati and Suri playing together again 15 years later, again, essentially having not played together properly since Micronesia, to where seeing that dynamic just really run this entire season was just very cool from a fan perspective here. Though again, from an edit perspective, it was just so clear that Parvati was the primary here, where we then proceed to cut to our first Suri confessional, which is entirely about Parvati, which I guess at this point early on in the season, you can maybe at least think that there's a chance of this being like a potential Liz to Shawnee edit, or maybe Suri is being attached to Parvati just for Parvati to be eventually sniped and Suri to inherit her edit, though clearly, again, I don't think they would want to do that for a global season. You would think they would try to make the winner look as good as possible here. But here we do end up seeing Rob really gathering the internationals on this tribe, pulling over Cass and telling her how dangerous the Americans are, and kind of openly talking about his deal with David to her, which again, I think is a bit questionable in the sense that, again, if people know that you have connections to the other side, you would think that would make them be worried about you coming into the merge. But through this conversation, you can definitely tell how domineering he's coming off here. But also, you then get some focus around Lisa, who talks about a lifelong dream was coming true and that she's able to meet Suri, and starts crying, where I was like, this was obviously a very endearing relationship here, seeing Lisa just so giddy over just the notion of meeting Suri. Again, telling her that she'd never go against her. And I do love how like Suri proceeds to say, well, I have no allegiances to anyone here, which is like, really? Like, really gonna believe this? But again, this sets up Lisa as really being in the center of the tribe, having a connection to the non-US players, but also having a connection to Suri, saying that this is the worst position anyone Survivor has ever been put in, because surely this is a terrible position to be in. But I love how we proceed to follow this with content about the men trying to build the fire, only for this to be interrupted by more Parvati confessionals, because again, Parvati needs to be all over this episode, where she talks about how the game is more than just the elements, it's more about each other, where we do proceed to see her flirting with Rob, saying that she eats guys like Rob for breakfast and wants him on her side as quickly as possible, which very much felt reminiscent to her relationship with James at first, with her calling out the fact that he was talking to David, with the reveal now that she knows David from another show, with them later explicitly saying Deal or No Deal Island, which I will say I am very surprised they allowed the name of the show to be said here. But and she ends up trying to utilize this David connection to build a bridge with Rob, openly saying that while she hasn't watched this season, she knows David loves him. To where I will say, I knew that David was a big Survivor fan. I did not realize he was tapped in to know who Rob Bentley was. Though as a whole, I actually do think this is fairly sloppy play from Parvati, again, telling this big secret here to Rob Bentley, who, again, she specifically even says earlier that she notices that he's really gathering the international players together, to where, again, I guess there's this notion of like you're trying to build a bond with him, to have him potentially keep you safe, though, again, giving him this big secret that could potentially blow up your game. Again, the internationals knowing that you have a connection to David would make them potentially want to split you and David up before the merge, especially when you're on a minority to begin with. I do think it's pretty sloppy play here. Again, straight up, I do not think this was the correct call for her game, especially as we see Rob proceed to not take this particularly well, saying that Parvati's game isn't going to work here and that he's loyal to his 4, and he promises one thing, that the American will be the first to go from the World Tribe and that will not break, which again clearly was overconfident content that was not going to stick. Then we cut to the Australia tribe, with George being the first to talk here, talking about how they have the best of the best despite only having one winner. But just in general, it does very much feel like George in particular was kind of screwed on this tribe, where, as previously mentioned, everyone really has a connection here to David David and Luke, with really George and Shawnee being the two kind of outliers on this cast. Now, obviously, considering the fact that George voted Shawnee out last time and is holding a grudge, it really puts George in this spot here where he had no true outs coming into this season, especially considering the massive target on his back, to where it very much felt like he was primed up to be one of the first boots of this season. And we do see him instantly trying to clear the air of Shawnee, saying he needs to reunite the Spice Girls, and finally tells her that he has no animosity towards her, with Shawnee saying, well, why would you? You voted me out, bro. To where they end up making a deal here to protect each other until the merge, only for Shawnee to reveal that she obviously doesn't want to work with him, with her saying it's a red flag that he's written a book about manipulation, and she wants revenge, but only has one name on her list now, and it's George, which makes you question, why isn't David on the list? David also voted her out. Also considering the fact that she later votes out David before George, which is all, again, very weird. Also, I don't think the correct call for her game. I feel like for Shawnee, it's like, I think you have to keep an eye out for George, but obviously George is in a spot where he also has no other real options. I think keeping George around, at least for a short term, probably would have been a better call for her than just instantly trying to get him out when everyone else is connected. This does lead to Shawnee talking about her strategy here, wanting to lower threat level, not have a public ride or die, seeming like a direct reaction to her game of Heroes vs. Villains. So we do see her making a secret alliance with Kirby. Again, we'll surely keep secret. Though again, it really just shows how Shawnee ends up playing this season. Again, her trying to seemingly avoid the mistakes she made in Heroes vs. Villains of becoming too blatant of a pair and be targeted because of that. And through that, again, she tries to play a more individualistic game, which again, I do think is interesting that she tried to adapt her game in this spot. Though again, I don't think it really works to her favor, where it just leaves her in a spot where she's mostly expendable to most people on the board. But this is when we did cut to David, who talks about how he was born to play this game and that this is the Olympics of Survivor, and lucky that he's Usain Bolt and he doesn't want to be the ray gun, to which we then cut to George, with again them just mocking George once again. This is where we do see George talking to David and Luke, saying that they're all shields for each other and they could have the best alliance ever that would break the internet, because surely the internet loves Luke. But again, they end up making a alliance here that is clearly fake from David and Luke's ends, with David proceeding to call them the Power Bottoms. With, again, they're just cutting to David, talking about how he's just humoring George and how he has no self-awareness, which I'll say as a whole, not a great look for David. I mean, I do think it feels a bit off, the fact that he's using like a gay slang term as his alliance name with George and then proceeding to make fun of him, which can come off as homophobic here. But again, George is just given such a dodo edit in this spot, with even the intro shot for him during the opening credits and ends up being him being hit by the Australian flag, where again he simply just was not taken seriously on this season. But with it, we then get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being a big obstacle course here of them having to carry around a giant staircase and eventually climb over a wall and do the typical box staircase puzzle, with us getting a pretty great moment through this of George telling Shawnee that we're actually going to do the boxes this time. Ends up finishing with a slingshot portion where we do see the Australians really struggling here, which is pretty surprising to me because I actually felt like they seemed like the stronger tribe physically. But we do see the world really struggling with the staircase puzzle, really arguing over when to put each block where, which leads to Australia taking the lead back and winning in the slingshot portion, with again it being shown as the men having messed up the challenge for the world tribe. But it does lead to David and Rob talking once again here, with Rob asking David to find the key for him, which leads to nothing. But also kind of interesting that they just assume that this is a spot where the other tribe would get the key for the box, which obviously we saw a twist similar to this in Titans vs. Rebels, though I don't know why this was their like first inclination here. And again, also just Rob openly making deals with David here. Again, just not a great look for him to the rest of his tribe. But we once again get Rob getting the typical overconfident confessional here, saying that he has a solid 4 and it's going to be an easy vote, with Suri being the best to never win, and that isn't changing today. To where we see him gathering all of the internationals and proceeding to say that he can bring Parvati into this, and clearly not knowing that Parvati and Suri are extremely tight, where again I do think that played a factor here into Rob Bentley's downfall. I do think the fact that he was just so aloof to Survivor history and did not know the connection that Parvati and Suri had really led to him probably not picking the ideal target here, where really not handling this particularly well, especially as he asks Parvati who she wants to take out, only for obviously just not give him an answer, and him to tell her Suri's name, only for Parvati to not really bite at that, with Rob being upset that she rejected his ticket out of this nonsense, and now she needs to go, which I mean, to be fair, it probably is actually easier to get rid of Parvati at this point than Suri, with Suri having Lisa in particular trying to protect her. But again, he ends up really pushing his alliance to vote for Parvati, and then proceeds to get Tony and Suri together, and then proceeds to get Tony and Suri and tells them to vote for Parvati to solidify the tribe coming into the merge, which I think the thing about all this is that conceptually, this is not the wrong thing to do for Rob Bentley. I actually do think this is, on paper, what should be the correct call. Again, keeping your 4-person alliance strong, getting the 2 people that survive on the outs to still feel like there is some sort of tribe unity. To where, again, I think it's a spot here where I don't think what Rob wants to do here is wrong. It's more so his approach here and domineering he comes off as. And I'm also not realizing how well Parvati and Suri can really work around him, where ultimately, again, this ends up being a vote where it seems like he's pretty tunnel visioned on either Parvati or Suri, where it is pretty surprising that Tony's name never comes up, where, again, this is a spot here where I think probably should have had the biggest reputation coming into this season. The fact that he's not even talked about as a potential target for his first vote is pretty insane. Now, at the same time, obviously some gender biases in play there. The fact that looked at as someone that helps with physical strength is something that definitely benefits him here. But again, still, like, Tony is someone that, as we saw in Game Changers, played like a complete loose cannon there. And to see him, again, kind of fix that aspect of his game and him kind of demonstrating what he did in Winners at War again here and being able to stay a bit under radar, I do think is, again, impressive for someone with as big of a reputation as him. But again, this entire sequence here is taken over by Parvati, who notices that Rob has stopped talking to her and proceeds to confront him here and proceeds to confront him, and obviously deducing that, yeah, he is voting for her, to where she says that she's offended that he's trying to blindside her. He doesn't know who he's messing with, only to cut that her talking to Suri, and Suri to be the one to mention that we have to cut off the head of the snake and Rob has to go, where I think this is, again, just a weird aspect of the season where clearly this season is Parvati and Suri working together. Yeah, it feels like the edit gives Parvati credit for pretty much everything they do, even at points where it very much benefits Suri more so than Parvati be doing the things that they're doing. It always chalks it up as Parvati was the one in these decision-making roles. It shows her perspective of these things. And it leads to, again, a very surreal moment here of us seeing Parvati and Suri confirming their vote for Rob, only for Tony to come running in and approaching them and them to proceed to tell him the name, and he says, "Say no more," and just walks away, where I do obviously think there is a question here of should Tony be targeting Rob, where, again, as much as I don't actually think there's that much to truly fault Tony for on this season, I do think him maybe siding with Suri and Parvati during his first vote may have been a misstep, but also it's a spot here where I don't know he would have really been able to build that loyalty with Cass and Lisa, and obviously, again, in his mind, he's in this like USA alliance at this point, to where, again, I do think there's a question here if even he should be on board with taking Rob out at this point. But considering even the all women's alliance didn't actually seem to be real until after this round, I don't really put too much blame onto him. But again, it's at this point that we do see Suri pulling over Lisa, with Lisa just spilling Rob's plan to her, that the plan's to vote Parvati, and she's not okay with how he dictates people, with Lisa, again, clearly set up as a swing here of her wanting to vote out Rob, though also is considering voting out Parvati to separate her and Suri, which I will say, like, she probably should have done. Where I do think, actually, for Lisa here, it would have been a much better call for her to, again, stick with the International Alliance, but also secure Suri more so as a number by taking out Parvati. Ends up being a more powerful position than what she later gets into, not having as much of a stranglehold on Suri, while also risking the international numbers, where I do think she ultimately makes the wrong call in this position. But here we do end up also seeing Parvati talking to Cass and Lisa, with Cass revealing to Parvati that Rob's saying her name, where this is really what I was expecting coming into the season, where I do think this very much felt like a group of women here that were very primed to create another Black Widow Brigade. Again, you already have Suri and Parvati as these original members of the Black Widow Brigade, but then also having Lisa, who's a big super fan of Suri, also Cass, who is someone that is a big fan of Parvati, and I think also would be open to go women strong, where ultimately, again, this is definitely what I was expecting coming into the season, is this group really taking the reins. And while it ends up ultimately happening, it actually turns out it wasn't as solid as I thought it was going to be, as it really feels like it's an alliance that actually comes together more so from Rob making himself a bigger target, more so than this being like this natural alliance that came together from the very beginning. But at this point, it is very much portrayed as Lisa, Cass, and Tommy as the swing votes, where it is pretty clear that they're going to be voting Rob out based on the edit, but then also how they were talking about it in their conversation, where as we get the tribal, where there is a lot of talk about the 4v3 splits of the US versus non-US, with Rob talking about this is not a time for blind sides and we need to be 100% unified with the vote, which is again very ironic. This leads to Rob just kind of out of the blue throwing Parvati under the bus, which you would think would be based around the notion of him picking up on the fact that he's about to be taken out, though it seems like no, he just did this kind of for the sake of it. Where he ends up revealing her secret about Dondi and David and talking about how she'll turn on them coming into the merge, where obviously Parvati ends up essentially saying the same thing back in this spot, considering everyone knows that Rob's also talking to David. But again, it's a position here where, again, this really just shows how sloppy Parvati's play here was about this Dondi secret, where, well, ultimately it doesn't end up mattering by the end. It is something that definitely could sow distrust between Parvati and the other women, and I still think it's a bit unclear here on how Cirie was feeling about all this, where we do literally see Cirie get up and ask Lisa and Cass if things are the same, where it very much felt like Cirie was willing to vote out Parvati here had she been told that Parvati was going. And it's funny that Rob is the person here to tell Cirie everything's the same when it's like, she's voting for you. But again, all this was just a very surreal, like very meta moment here of Deal or No Deal actually mattering to Australian Survivor versus the world. But anyway, we do get to the vote where Rob ends up voting for Cirie, saying this is just a backup in case an idol gets played, which is again pretty insane, which is again kind of funny that Rob is so confident in the Parvati vote that he's willing to split his own vote, even though again I think it's actually probably the right call for him. Though also a position here where, again, a lot of talk ends up being by the end of the season, this talk about how Parvati never got any votes, when it's like, and she was clearly intended to get votes. Again, Rob actually wanted to vote for Parvati. He just thought it was a good split vote. To where, again, I think a lot of people like really giving Parvati a lot of credit for never having a vote against her is just, again, kind of dumb to me. But ultimately ends up being a 6-1 Rob vote, with him leaving, saying that this will guarantee the Aussies will win Survivor now. And what do you know? Rob's wrong again. But also, again, Rob Bentley ends up being the first boot of the season. That is insane. I cannot believe Rob Bentley is the first boot of any Survivor season, let alone AU versus the world. And at a spot where he is such a physical presence on a show that is known for its physicality, again, to see Rob be the first boot of that is shocking. And ultimately, it feels like he did it to himself. A lot of the extra press is very negative towards him, talking about how domineering he was and how he didn't allow his alliance to speak. And again, it does feel like his alliance members did not like how he handled them, to where ultimately, again, I do think there is obviously fault here to be had with how Rob played this. So ultimately, again, I do think he had the right idea of what he wanted to do in the game. It's just, again, he was fairly ineffective in getting that through, though again, it doesn't really diminish my opinion of Rob Bentley as a player too much. I feel like we kind of just got what I expected in terms of like how exactly he played, where again I expected him to try to do a similar sort of game again, and I didn't really expect it to go nearly as well with a group of returning players, though again I am a bit surprised he was still the first boot of the season, though I thought he had an incredible like villain edit on this season. I thought he had a great downfall that actually made him a pretty satisfying first boot by the end. But now for episode 2, possibly the best episode of the entire season, definitely up there. An episode almost entirely revolving around the Australia tribe, with only one segment at the World Tribe, which to be fair is pretty typical Australian Survivor fare. But at the World Tribe, we do get content revolving around Parvati. What a shocker, with her talking about how she's the Black Widow. Again, also what a shocker. But we see her gathering the women in front of Tony, with us then getting some focus around Tony, recognizing that an all-women's alliance is probably coming together, seemingly bonding with Tommy over this, but realizing the precarious position that he's currently in, with us clearly setting up Tony as the next to go, where it just seems like he's just clearly outnumbered here in a spot where, again, I don't think he does that much like actively wrong. I think it takes a lot of foresight to be avoiding a situation like this, and again, it wasn't really given a particularly good draw based on just who was around him at the start of the game to begin with, where ultimately, again, I just think Tony ends up being on the bottom here, again, clearly set up to go in a spot where I can't point out a single thing that he like actively does wrong, to where, again, I think he's even able to effectively replicate his Winners at War strategy of just putting himself in house arrest, and again, that led to him just not even being talked about as a target throughout that first round. But again, he can only do so much when he had so many cards stacked against him despite that. But again, the episode largely does focus around the Australia tribe, with us getting a lot of focus initially on Luke, with the reveal that he stole the tribe's bananas and shares them with Shawnee, a relationship that doesn't go anywhere. Oh, we also see him sharing with David, which leaves them talking about their bond, but he has his eyes behind his back just in case, which also doesn't lead to anything. But all this culminates in Luke finding his idol, which again, he will surely make a lot of use of. And he says that he's not going to tell anyone about this idol because he will surely never tell anybody about this idol. But again, this big highlight on Luke here made it feel pretty clear that he was going to be an integral character for this season, even though, again, none of this content actually means anything. But following that, we get some content revolving around David. We talk about how he's such a big target and he knows everyone here except for Kirby. Though we do see him trying to work with Kirby here, trying to get her to trust him and make sure that George and Shawnee are on the outs, only for Kirby to clearly not be on board and instead working more so with the likes of Shawnee and George, with him talking about who to take out first, with George mentioning Janine, only for Kirby to be confused and say, why not David? Where kind of surprisingly, George is really pushing doing the easy vote here and voting for Janine. Now, I know that he was also thinking that he had an alliance with David and was probably trying to protect David in this spot, though, again, just kind of opposed to the typical gameplay style that George is kind of known for. But it ends up leading Kirby into this crusade against David, with her first going to Luke, trying to get Luke to turn on David, which I don't think he was ever going to do. And to be honest, again, he shouldn't really do until like the very end of the game. I'll always see Shawnee also not really be on board, also wanting to take out George first, which again, don't think that's the right call for her. We then see her go to Sarah, and Sarah to actually be the only person to not instantly shut this down, saying she has to think about it as he's her shield, which is like, why are you thinking about this? You shouldn't be thinking about this. And there should be a very clear-cut decision. Again, Sarah is someone that has known David for years, is someone that is a very integral number for someone like Sarah in this game, and for her to just be willing to throw away David here for Kirby is just very bizarre, where it ends up coming from this place that Sarah says that she doesn't want to play the way she did last time, where last time she played a very fluid game, one that had her not really remaining loyal to a single person, and her way of doing that is by voting out an actual friend of hers for a person that she barely knows in Kirby, because obviously that's the way to remain loyal in the game, where obviously again it would have been just better off if you made David your person that you're loyal to instead of Kirby. But she ends up later going to Kirby and telling her that she's come around on the idea of David, with it clearly setting up David as a prime target for their tribe, to where Kirby already ends up declaring herself the God Slayer, because it's Australian Survivor. Either way, we get to the immunity challenge really early into the episode, where even after it, we still have over half the episode left, though there obviously is a lot of shock over Rob being gone, and it being just in time for an extremely physical challenge of them having to use a battering ram to get through a course, then transport blocks on a shelf, and then knocking them over like a typical carnival game. And again, you would assume the World Tribe without Rob here would be at a massive disadvantage, but we do actually see Tony really leading them well here, getting a pretty massive lead leading into the tossing section, where we do see Tony and David going back and forth here. I did find it funny that George is rooting David on here, just calling him GG. But again, ultimately, Tony pulls out the win here. Was probably one of his most impressive performances in any single challenge, really being the star player here for the World Tribe. But it's following this, so we get content from David saying that George is going home, which again should make it very clear that George isn't going home, and also make it way more likely David's going home. But we do see David really leading the charge against George here, saying that the king's head has gotten too big and he doesn't care about God no more. Only for Kirby to be worried about all the connections that David has, while George obviously doesn't have any, and through that decides that again David has to go, saying that she has Sarah and Shawnee on board and George has no other options. At least you would think that. Though, to be fair, again, as long as Kirby has Shawnee and Sarah locked in, it actually doesn't really matter what George does in this spot, as either way you would have the majority on the revote, which we essentially see happen. But again, George clearly tries to push the vote onto Janine instead of David, with us seeing David and Luke pretending to be on board with voting for Janine, all also failing to get Kirby to back down, though seemingly thinking that this plan is actually going through, where he just for some reason actually thinks that everyone's voting for Janine here, with him just being kind of aloof at this point in the game. But this leads to George proceeding to warn David that he needs to play his idol, with them again just seemingly kind of snowed by him. And it's a spot where I do find it very funny how George proceeds to say that he needs to play the as long as it isn't me strategy, which is like, this is literally not that. You're warning someone that they're going home. That's not anybody but you. But anyway, we do see Sarah telling Kirby she's on board a David plan because she wants to prove she's trustworthy, and when she'll do something, she does it, only to then not actually go through that because she actually still wants David to stay in the game, despite the fact that she is still planning on voting for David, which is all really stupid. Proceeding to tell Janine to warn David that he needs to play his idol because multiple people need to warn David to play his idol, which again, I'll say at least credit to David to a degree. Mind you, again, a lot of this is based on pregame connections. And he, at the end of the day, it does really drop the ball here of Sarah, where again, Sarah has no reason to be voting him out. At least he was able to get warned about his blind side to where he could at least least attempt to counter it. But we do see David saying that he needs to find out who's out to get him now, with him walking in on a conversation between George and Kirby, where they end up talking about making their first big move, and Kirby proceeding to leak to him that the plan was to split the vote between him and Shawnee, only for George to proceed to confront David when he approaches over the votes being split on him, and later also tell him that Kirby is the one driving his name. Again, in front of Kirby, which I really don't understand why he does this. Like, this is just such a ridiculous move here where, again, Kirby literally is trying to save you in the game, and you're really just blowing up her spot right in front of her while also leaking information she just told you. It's just such a bizarre move here. And again, it really can only be explained by just how snowed he was by David. Thinking that this Power Bottoms group was actually sticking together when, again, was always just fake from David's point of view. And all this really does is just incentivize Kirby to potentially stop this blindside plan and put the votes back onto George, which we do end up seeing David pitching to Kirby, which ends up being a humorous sequence here of David being just, again, so great in the confessional, talking about how humiliating it is that the golden god had to walk to the water's edge, and proceeds to beg. Which also, I did find it very funny, the dichotomy between him in confessional and him on the island, with him being just very calm in his pitch to Kirby, yet being so over the top in confessional. But ultimately, it does lead to Kirby seemingly backing down here and agreeing with Sarah that they should just settle on going for George. To which we proceed to see Sarah once again tell David that they're going for George and that she's going to bet her friendship on that, which... why say that? Either way, it did seem like George was getting voted out of Tribal, seemingly due to his own actions here, until he just miraculously gets saved when we get the Tribal, as we do get this like very strange editing here of like Kirby being deep at thought in Tribal that felt very Survivor 48 coded, of like Kirby just zoning out all the other conversations, just staring at David, seemingly changing her mind at Tribal here to switch the target back onto David last second, leading to a lot of whispers at the Tribal here, with Kirby telling Shawnee and Sarah to vote for David, with Sarah being visibly upset by all this, though for some reason ends up still getting on board by the end. David picks up on what's happening here and starts doing whispers of his own, first getting Janine and Luke to agree to vote for Shawnee instead of George, obviously out of self-preservation there, with the intent to pull George into that vote, leading to a lot of scrambling here that, again, I thought was very fun. And I know a lot of the fan base seems to hate live tribals like this. Yeah, I personally really miss these, as I feel like we don't get that many of them in modern Survivor. I feel like post New Era, I feel like live tribals like really just died down. And again, it was nice to see like this level of gameplay here, all this last second scrambling, too, for obviously the shortened time frame of the season probably helped with that as well. Obviously less time to have conversations, but I did find it very refreshing just how many live tribals we get across this season. But anyway, we see George here agreeing to vote for Shawnee. For, again, if David really wanted to stay, he could have just actually stayed loyal to George here, only for them to just decide to not trust him anyway and decide to still vote for George, all while lying to George about switching the vote to Janine, which I don't get why they did that. Which, I mean, if I'm George also in this spot, like, this should just be further proof that I should just be voting out David. And again, just further shows just how deluded he seemed to be in the game here, how much he just didn't be aware of the fact that Janine was just never really an option here. As again, this should have just really pointed out to him more so the fact that no one's on his side, as again, why would David and Luke want to get rid of Janine here? So again, we do get to the vote where George is the only one to end up voting for Janine, while David, Luke, and Janine end up voting for George. Again, putting more hope into Sarah, Kirby, and Shawnee being on board with that, over trusting George, which turned out to be a bad call, as obviously they end up voting for David, leading to a 3-3-1 tie between David and George, obviously leading to David just being kind of screwed on the revote here based on how the vote's laid out, where obviously his vote gets nullified from his side, while George's, again, was a throwaway vote to begin with. To where, again, Kirby's group does have the majority on the revote, and David goes home, again, kind of at his own hand here, to where while I do get what he was doing by the end, it is really his distrust of George that really ends up costing him his game, because it did seem like he had George on board for the Shawnee plan at a point to where, and that would have just saved everybody and still keep him in pretty good position, though he kind of just ended up throwing that away. And I even mentioned here is the fact that Luke also had an idol, his number one ally, who theoretically could have used the idol on him. Now, I don't think it would have been the correct call for Luke, and I don't know if Luke himself would have been willing to do so either way, but again, it's definitely an option there for David that he was just never privy to, and again, was never able to use to his benefit. But again, we do see David leaving here, saying that this is the last time I'm playing Australian Survivor, and congrats, you retired me. To where, again, we will surely never see David on Australian Survivor ever again. But with that, again, we lose David, the Golden God, and I will say, I found him pretty fun on this season. I mean, David's someone that I think always makes incredible TV, just really great in the confessional, and I think we got a lot of that on this season. Now, ultimately, again, gameplay-wise, there definitely were a lot of missed opportunities here. Again, the fact that he came in such a good position, really just squandered that from the beginning, never was able to gain Kirby's loyalty, really lost Sarah's, didn't trust George, whose loyalty he had. Again, there were definitely some bad calls made across this season, though ultimately, again, my opinion of David as a player, though, doesn't really change based on this appearance. I do feel like at the end of the day, again, he did have a pretty big target on his back, which I think definitely added to the likes of Kirby and Sarah being willing to turn on him. And really outside of David, still, again, was able to maintain some allies, gets taken out in a very wonky boat here. Again, I think there are people that played actively worse on this season, though, again, David definitely had a lot of outs here that just simply did not come together by the end. But with that, we then get to episode 3, another pretty solid episode here, another one revolving around the Australia tribe, where initially we do focus around the reaction to the David vote, with a lot of propping up of Kirby here, with this really increasing the target on her back, with her getting the sole credit for the move, which I will say as a whole, the move was 100% the right call for Kirby. I mean, it is a move that allows Kirby to really take control of this tribe. Again, theoretically, obviously, again, if you later lose to Sarah because of it, but again, it's still a spot where getting rid of David, this person that is so well connected in the game, not just the people on this tribe, but also the party connection on the other side, it just makes so much sense to get rid of David for Kirby in particular, to where I do think it was the right call for her, even though, again, the aftermath of it probably wasn't handled the greatest, and it does really expedite the target on her back here. But beyond that, we get some focus around this new feud between Luke and George, with George blaming Luke for having told him to vote Janine at the last second, and George now just openly declaring that he's going after Luke, with, again, this furthering this underdog run for Luke here, because he'll surely be on the bottom and certainly have difficulty turning this vote on George. But we then proceed to see George thanking Kirby for saving him the previous night, and proceeds to eat a piece of rice off her face, which was weird, all while telling Shawnee that he feels good and that he owes her one and will champion the name she wants out around camp, only for Shawnee to, again, not want to work with him, calling him not a cockroach, but he has tendencies cockroaches have. So she doesn't want to miss her opportunity to get rid of George, where she doesn't want to be the Stevie or be Sue's big move, where, again, obviously a very meta moment there. But again, this is clearly just setting up George for a fall here. But while the result here was fairly obvious, I feel like the path there was a lot more turbulent than you would expect, where, again, we do get Sarah here regretting how the last vote played out and being upset that Kirby gave her no other option, because, again, she surely had no other options. But she says that the loyal game has burned her, and Shawnee's relationship with Kirby complicates things, and feels like she's in an open relationship, where there's clearly just a lot of tension here between Sarah and Kirby, where we do see Sarah attempting to get Kirby to vote out Shawnee, to essentially make it even for her having voted out David. And while we do see Kirby reluctantly agreeing here, this clearly wasn't going to stick, as really Kirby has no real incentive to really stick with this. Especially as, again, George is just such an easy consensus boot. Again, Luke and Janine want George out. Shawnee wants George out. She wants George out. So again, for Kirby, it just makes no sense to really be going through this. And that's, again, kind of the issue with Sarah's move to begin with. It really just gave Kirby all the leverage in their relationship. Sarah really has their relationship clearly being on the rocks. But with that, we then finally get back to the World Tribe, where, again, we get more of the same content of Tony being worried about the women. Then we get a lot of focus around the box, with Tony wanting to keep the box where everyone can see it, seemingly trying to propel this notion of using the box for the tribe, clearly, again, in the case that someone else finds it so that they don't use it against him. But again, we do end up seeing everyone searching for the key, with Parvati being the one to end up finding it right in front of Cass and Sri, which obviously this just solidifies the women's alliance even more, and ultimately obviously leading to her getting an idol, which ends up being a pretty integral piece in her game. Though, to open the box, we do get a typical heist-like sequence here of them trying to open the box with no one seeing, only for Tony to show up and Parvati to sit on the box to mask what they were doing, and they have to create a plan to get him away from camp, which involves Lisa taking him to the water well, which is very funny how, the edit really shows this as, Parvati and Suri mastermind this plan, when it was, Tony himself that volunteered to go to the water well. But it's like he probably would have just done this anyway. But we do proceed to see him having a conversation with Lisa, which again is shown as them distracting him here. So we do get this very funny interaction of her proceeding to tell him that he's the best, only for him to then drop the ladle at the water well and proceed to have Lisa hold on to him as he dunks himself in the water to retrieve it, which is all just a very funny visual here. Again, just kind of surreal to see Tony Velachos and Lisa interacting in this way. But Parvati and Sri end up eventually opening the box, and inside is a clue to an idol at JLP's podium, aka the idol Adam Klein wanted in Winners at War, also aka Palesa's idol from Survivor South Africa, where, again, I don't know how purposeful this is, but again, this is kind of a cool little moment here of like the Palesa idol becoming real again, an idol actually being hidden in the podium at Tribal. So we get a lot of hype here over how they'll have to expose themselves to get it, only for them to not actually have to expose themselves when they get it. But following this, we do see the women still pretending to look for the key to obviously not add suspicion from the men, to which during this we see Cass finding the real idol while searching with Suri and Lisa, and somehow ends up having them not see it, which is pretty insane. But she ends up keeping this idol to herself, saying that she's learned from her mistakes last time, and really talking up a big game here, really implying her not trusting Parvati and being willing to make a move against the Women's Alliance, which we never see her do. But again, I do think we got to see a little bit more of this, at least talk about having a killer instinct from Cass, more so than what she did the first time around. But either way, we get to the immunity challenge, where again, we get the reaction to David being voted out, with Parvati being happy that her target's off of her now. So good for her. But it ends up being the endurance challenge, where you have to keep the bag over your head. And this ends up being a pretty fun challenge here, with some fun banter between the two tribes. Parvati bragging about her Micronesia immunity win, where she went for 6.5 hours. Only for us to later see like Tony helping Suri hold her bag up, only for George tries to trick him into dropping his bag. We see George doing a lot of talking that ends up really annoying his tribe mates, revealing tribe secrets, like that he's barely survived the David vote, and making it pretty clear that he would flip if he made it to the merge, because again, he would kind of have to, which I'm sure did not help the target on his back. But surprisingly, Suri is actually the only person to even drop out throughout this entire challenge before the end, to which it ends up being a pretty lengthy endurance challenge with both tribes performing fairly well, though ultimately Sarah ends up dropping out, giving the World Tribe the win. And with Australia going to Tribal once again, it is pretty apparent that George is going home, where we do see Shawnee getting credit for putting the target on George's back and saying now it's time to get revenge, where we see George feeling fairly good coming into Tribal, saying he trusts the girls as they could have dogged him last time, when it's like, you didn't vote with them last time. Like, why wouldn't you think there's a chance of that changing this time around? But again, we see his perspective of things, with him now wanting to split the vote between Luke and Janine, while also wanting Luke and Janine to vote for each other and attempting to strong arm them into doing so, which I don't get why he was so gung-ho on this, as this really does not matter. And I find it funny how Janine just openly refuses here. We also see him like trying to goad Luke into playing his idol, despite saying, I don't think you have one, which all just felt like George being very overconfident in this spot. Though again, I do find it very funny how Shawnee proceeds to say that George has only played with amateurs, but his gameplay style won't work on the best of the best, which, like, you know, you were one of the players that played with him before this, right? And he beat you. But either way, again, we do get the Shawnee theme music playing, and her starting to campaign against George, which again is really portrayed as like her masterminding this move, and again just felt like kind of the obvious move for most people here anyway. But again, we proceed to see her campaigning to Luke, and Luke agreeing to target George, even though he's going to do that anyway, and really just the entire tribe ends up agreeing on this target, only for Sarah to just be annoyed that she never get what she wants. Though again, we once again get a level of intrigue at the last second here from Janine, deciding to split the vote onto Shawnee just in case George has an idol. Something that, again, could have been avoided if Luke had told her he had an idol. But here again, she feels the need to split the vote into Shawnee, now opening an opportunity for Sarah to take out Shawnee, as really all she needs is her own vote plus either Kirby or George to put their vote in the Shawnee, and that would allow Shawnee to be kind of taken out by accident here. We do see her making one final push here to Kirby to try to get Kirby to flip, with Kirby seemingly being on board here, talking about needing to keep Sarah's loyalty. This is where we leave off going in the Tribal, though again, they ultimately end up flipping back, and again, that part of it's never truly explained here. But ultimately, again, we go into tribal with George coming off very confident here, talking about how they can't vote him out as they'll need him for the merge, with him having experience forming majorities at the merge from minority positions, and all just coming off very pushy here to Janine and Luke, which finally ends up convincing Janine even more that George must have an idol, because surely why would anyone act this confident when they don't have an idol? But this leads to Janine whispering to Luke to switch his vote to Shawnee to, again, further split the vote here against George, with Luke instantly saying done, being this moment that they mention as this moment that really solidified their relationship. Again, clearly not the fact that they've been friends for like 5 years now. But really, this should have been just the plan to begin with. I mean, once Janine's already splitting her vote, like, why not just go all out and actually split the vote properly? But really, all this ends up being unnecessary as, again, Luke has the idol, George doesn't. But again, what's funny is that Luke knows this, yet still goes along with this plan anyway, which could have backfired in leading to Shawnee going home had Sarah stuck to her guns. But ultimately, you get to the vote where George ends up voting for Luke, saying you're playing with the big boys now and you need to take off your floaties, because surely George is playing so much better than Luke right now. Always see Shawnee voting for George, her noting that she's doing this for her 50th tribal, which seems very specific. Always see Luke voting for Shawnee, only to then still have a confessional mocking George and mentioning Macedonian Jesus, which it's funny that Luke is the only person to mention Macedonian Jesus on this season. But either way, it ends up being a 3-2-1 here against George, but again, just kind of unpurposely, where the two obviously come from that split for Shawnee. Well, despite the fact that, again, Shawnee gets a lot of credit for leading this vote, it ultimately ends up being a vote that almost backfired on her. And I do love how, like, George is really blindsided here and proceeds to say to Shawnee, I hope it was you. Only for Shawnee to say it was, which is like, I mean, kind of. Says, not the Shawnees, though, with Janine just openly apologizing here, saying it's her fault, which again, I can find funny how forthright she was about it here. But anyway, that we end up losing George. And George is someone that I think this season played out pretty much as poorly as it could have. It pretty much proved my biggest fears about George as a player, where, again, we've obviously seen him play twice before. His first appearance, very rocky, but ultimately ends up playing a fairly impressive game by the end. His second time played an extremely impressive game. This time around, not so much, and I think it really just further cements my overall opinions on George, and that I do think he is a largely inconsistent player. I feel like he's one that, again, if he's able to get a stranglehold, he'll be able to pull off some very impressive maneuvers, but I just don't know how often he'll be able to get that stranglehold. And obviously, again, I think he was very unfortunate in how this tribe was laid out, to where he was kind of screwed from the offset. But again, even within that, I don't think he makes optimal plays, even considering his positioning, where, again, in comparison to Tony, who was also in this poor of position, I don't feel like Tony does as much actively wrong as George does, where it just felt like a spot of, like, George kind of sabotaging his own position throughout a lot of this season and not really knowing what was going on throughout most of the season, where ultimately, again, I think this is a fairly underwhelming appearance from George, though again, it is still King George. He's still an incredible character for the show, yet just, again, didn't bring too much gameplay wise this time around. And over episode 4, which was not as strong of an episode, largely due to the fact that we had a very convoluted twist that also led to a fairly predictable outcome. But either way, the episode does start with Shawnee gloating about taking out George and getting him out on his day 99 so that he doesn't make the 100-day marker, which again is just another random stat there. And again, talks about she feels on top of the world, despite the fact that she had 2 votes go against her and probably is the next to go from her tribe, where I don't know why she feels so good. Always see Luke continuing to just bash on George, saying, kiss my ass, King George, saying that I'll enjoy the glory while you enjoy the death. But ultimately, this leads to more drama between the Sarah-Kirby relationship, with Sarah noticing that Kirby isn't with her anymore and that proving her loyalty gave her nothing. And now Kirby is giving her no other option, which I guess is just the thing Kirby does, is give Sarah no options in the game. As Sarah proceeds to go to Janine and tells her that she's getting weird vibes from Kirby and doesn't trust her anymore. And to follow up on that, she decides that the plan should be to vote out Shawnee, which, why? Like, if you're gonna take a shot, just take the shot at Kirby at this point. But again, it is funny how this leads to Luke and Janine not even trusting Sarah at this point, deciding that Kirby's actually more solid of an ally, and proceed to tell Kirby about Sarah turning on her, which does lead to Kirby saying that isn't what ride or dies do, and when you hear your name, you shoot your shot, to where obviously it sets up Sarah to be in potential danger, again, almost as if she's gonna need immunity. Oh, you get some content from the World Tribe, where Parvati gets to talk about how great of of a position she's in, that she's running back the playbook from Micronesia. And if the World Tribe doesn't win, the boys are going home. To where we do see the women getting together in a secret meeting to agree on a name for the next vote, only to just not end up agreeing, where Parvati and Suri end up wanting to keep Tony around. Oh, Lisa and Cass want to keep Tommy around, with Cass getting a lot of focus here and a lot of credit here for pushing the vote onto Tony, which is just kind of insane that Cass from Survivor Quebec is the person to take Tony out of the game here. But again, it's technically a spot here where Parvati isn't really getting her way. Again, despite the fact that Parvati is in this like dominant position for a lot of the season, she's not really getting her way at many points in the season. This is kind of one of those where she does actively want Tony to stay, that she's just not really able to get her side to see her way here. But while all this is happening, we see Tony and Tommy back at camp, obviously realizing they're on the outs, and make a deal to work together, which will surely matter. But anyway, we get to the immunity challenge, where we have Luke telling the other tribe that George didn't see it coming and it was pretty crazy, which isn't this just you leaking tribe secrets, which you were upset, George, for doing that last episode? But either way, we get the reveal here that they're not playing for tribal immunity, they're playing for individual immunity, because this is surely going to be a double elimination, because they need a double elimination at some point. So again, this will clearly be it, right? Anyway, this ends up being an endurance comp of having to hold up a wooden block with your feet, to which we do see Lisa sitting out due to a medical issue, which is never explained. Oh, well, we see Kirby whispering to Parvati that I want to work with you, where again, I wonder if that'll lead to anything. But the beginning of this challenge ends up being just kind of funny in how loudly Luke is grunting the entire time, and ends up being the first out with JLP just laughing at him. And really just in general, the Australians do fairly poorly here, with Sarah end up winning her side of the challenge before literally any of the world members end up dropping out. And again, I can't believe Sarah won right after we got talk about how she's in danger. But eventually the world members start to drop as well, with Tommy and Tony first, leaving the 3 women, which I'll say, good for Suri, lasting almost an hour into this competition. It does ultimately come down to Cass versus Parvati, with Parvati trying to make a deal with Cass here to drop out in exchange for Parvati dropping out for Cass in a future immunity challenge, which is obviously a terrible deal, and Cass doesn't take it at first, though does when she's clearly about to drop anyway, linked to Parvati winning immunity here. To where now they're told that despite the fact that both tribes are going to tribal, only one player will be going home tonight, which again, why? And even then, they're not told how the person will go home, which is just, again, really dumb. Again, it just leads to a lot of speculation over what they're going to do here. Are they going to do what they did in All-Stars of having 2 players voted out and then they compete in fire to stay in the game, which is what I was actually thinking they were going to do. Again, is it a joint tribal here? But no, it's actually something dumber than that. And again, just not telling them what's about to happen really just stifles gameplay here, gives them less incentive to really go all out in trying to figure out what to do at the vote, because they don't know what is going to happen at the vote here. And again, that just ends up being kind of a lame aspect of the scramble here, though. Again, we do see Kirby clearly being annoyed at Sarah having won immunity, but this ultimately just leads to the vote just easily landing on Shawnee, to where despite the fact that Kirby doesn't like the idea of it, it did seem like it was going to go through, as again, she's kind of forced to now, where really without Sarah as a number, she can't really do anything in this spot, where the only other options would be Luke or Janine, and she'd have to get Sarah to vote on one of them, to where I never felt like that was going to happen, to where again, it did feel like Shawnee was pretty easily going to go home. Though we do see Shawnee campaigning to Luke to vote out Janine, as you don't want to be voted out by the same person twice. And Janine would be going after him eventually because of that. As again, she's expecting people to think about the game the way she does. But again, Luke ends up sticking true here. And again, it felt like Shawnee was on her way to go. All on the World Tribe, it's still between Tommy and Tony, with Cass saying it's not going to be Tommy and talking to Lisa, to where they end up being on the same page here. And we do end up seeing them very much relying on Suri, where we do see Lisa saying she trusts Suri, but Parvati not as much. And it very much felt like Suri just had the better connections on this World Tribe here, was in the much better position within this alliance, where it felt like Parvati is actually kind of on the outs and really just clinging on because of her connection to Suri. But again, with Suri on board, it became pretty clear that Tony was set up to be taken out here, where while again, it felt like Parv still did want Tony to stay, and we don't really see the full alliance get on board with this plan. It just felt pretty apparent that Tony was on his way out here, with Suri again not being willing to risk the Girls Alliance for Tony, while also Tony obviously just being a very dangerous player in himself. And also taking out Tony, again, earns a little bit of trust with the women and taking out a USA number to where ultimately, I fully do understand the decision here from Suri, though we do get talk from Suri about how she's worried that Parvati could tell Tony about the podium idol, which it's like, why would she do that? Like, that would be really stupid for her to do that, to waste an idol here on Tony. Realistically, it's not even that good of an ally for her. Really, Tony's just a shield potentially for her, and really one that she doesn't really need either. But either way, we do see the Americans talking here, and Suri telling Tony that it's Tommy, only for Tony to very clearly recognize something's off here, where, again, the edit doesn't really show this, but I would expect that both Suri and Parvati knew that Tony was going home at this point, and that's why it was very awkward, though. Again, Tony leaves this conversation knowing he's the next to go, to where he talks about how he's certain that Parvati and Suri must have found the key and that he isn't going down without trying, and he's going to go King George style on them, which I guess is what we're calling live tribals now. But, we get the tribal where everyone is here at tribal, to where we then get the reveal of the twist where only one person will be going home because only one tribe will be voting. And the tribe that does will be determined by a fire making challenge. Why? As again, this is just all so senseless here. As one, it kind of makes the previous immunity winners just kind of pointless. Like, why do we do individual immunity if there's still technically an immunity challenge here, which is just the fire making challenge? And again, you're essentially giving individual immunity to somebody that won't need it by the end. As realistically, again, this isn't that different from a normal round. Just the immunity challenge was happening at tribal, and through that, again, it just kind of stagnates gameplay because they just didn't know what was happening here. But the worst part of all this is the fact that they decided to also just add like a level of randomness to this for no reason, of making the person that does the fire making challenge determined by a random draw, which I just question, like, why? Like, I would get it if the immunity winners were the ones to participate here. At least there'll be some reason for them to be doing it. Also, I think it would have been interesting if the tribes themselves got to pick who did the fire making challenge, but from this to determine it by a random draw just felt very unnecessary, where the world tribe really gets screwed here by having Suri get picked for this, who is notorious for not being good at fire making. And to be fair, she was kind of fortunate to go against Sarah, who is someone that isn't that good either. But again, it's still a spot here where it very much feels like Tony kind of gets screwed just by a random draw of Suri being the one to do the fire making challenge for the world tribe. Though even throughout the fire making challenge, despite the fact that Sarah was not particularly good, it still felt pretty clear Suri was going to lose this, to where we do see Tony like frantically trying to give her advice, only for it to not be particularly effective. Always see Sarah get really mocked on their show for doing this like ridiculous swing method of swing the husk around, with Suri proceeding to decide to do the same thing, which was weird. But again, Sarah ends up winning here in a spot where I know some people claimed immediately after the episode that they thought Suri was throwing this challenge. Just like, why would she throw this challenge? Like, to where again, I get her letting Tony go if they do go to a vote, but again, she should not be actively wanting to vote out Tony in this spot. And really, if anything, Sarah is the person that probably should have thrown here in retrospect, where I think for Sarah, getting rid of Shawnee is actually a lot more integral for her. So ultimately, I mean, she's probably just screwed either way, but again, at least Shawnee is someone that you have an actively hostile relationship with, where both of them know that they just simply cannot work with each other, where that's not necessarily the case with Suri and Tony, where I feel like that's more repairable, to where ultimately, again, like, I think this is a spot where Sarah probably should have thrown this challenge, though ultimately doesn't. But again, we get to the actual tribal, which ends up being, again, another insane live tribal here, because again, they didn't know what they were doing beforehand, so now they have to actually lock in the vote, with Cass proceeding to tell the Women's Alliance to vote for Tony, with Parvati not really pushing back here. And again, I think it's a spot where it's a bit tough to push back on, considering you were not able to really do the legwork beforehand, and you have Cass, who's someone that's seemingly very resolute in this decision. But ultimately, you see Tony confronting Cass, asking her, who are we voting for, only for her to say, I don't know, leading to Tony going all out during this tribal, saying he knows what he's doing tonight, and he's going to secure himself, they're with me or not, to which he then pulls out a shoe and puts it around his neck and says he feels protected tonight, bluffing his shoe as an idol, which is just kind of an insane moment here. And again, really just shows you just how innovative of a player Tony is. The fact that he's really willing just to do anything to stay in this game, that he's willing to pretend this shoe is an idol, which is, again, just so weird. But I did actually feel like Tony played this fairly interestingly, again, proceeding to go to Tommy, and actually at this point dropping the Americans and trying to get on board with the internationals, which, to be fair, fair, like while it was never going to work, I actually do feel like that was his way of surviving here, where at this point it did feel more likely that Cass and Lisa would have flipped against someone like Parvati over Parvati and Suri turning against Cass or Lisa. So again, he gives a valiant try here, though at the end of the day, again, it is kind of funny that he's really trying to blow up Parvati's game here in a spot where she's really the only one that actively wanted him still in the game, which he ends up revealing that he knows that Parvati found the key, which is, again, funny that it's a bluff on his end, though it ends up actually being accurate. Now, at the end of the day, again, both Cass and Lisa already knew about this, so again, it doesn't really have as much of an impact, though I did like him, again, at least trying to pretend like she told him to sow distrust here, but it never felt like it was going to be enough to save him, to where, again, it is pretty funny that we do get this, like, Parvati-Tony argument over while everyone else is on the side trying to figure out where to vote, where, again, this ends up being a pretty explosive exit from Tony, with Parvati getting clearly annoyed at him here and saying that she's ready to vote, to where ultimately Tony ends up actually voting for Suri here, and kind of being, again, just being another point where despite Parvati being targeted, the vote ends up actually landing on Suri instead, but we do get Tony proceeding to then pretend that he's going to play his idol, only to say, you know what, I'll save it for the merge, because you'll surely get there. All obviously just leads to a unanimous Tony vote here, where again, at least he exited in a pretty fun way here. Though as they are leaving for tribal, we see Parvati asking JOP to hold her torch, to where she ends up grabbing the idol from the podium after everyone else leaves, which I will say, I don't know if this should be allowed. I feel like this kind of ruins the point of the podium idol, the fact that you're able to grab it when no one else is there. Like, the point of getting the idol is the fact that you have to do it literally in front of everybody. The fact that you can get it after tribal concludes kind of just, again, ruins the point of this entire thing. But ultimately, again, Parvati has an idol by the end of this, and it does end up putting her in a fairly powerful position moving forward. But either way, again, we end up losing Tony, and I thought this was a fun enough run from Tony. At the end of the day, again, he did not get the greatest amount of screen time and did not get the greatest amount of character moments, but again, what we did get was fun. Again, him putting his head in the well was a ridiculous moment. Him obviously having this shoe idol at the end here was fun. And again, ultimately, I feel pretty good about Tony as a player coming out of this, where obviously, again, Tony is someone that I already has my favorite player as the best player of all time, and I actually do feel like my opinion of him as a player went up from this season, despite the fact that he's an early boot, where if anything, I feel like we've kind of seen now that the way that Tony will approach the game more times than not is in the winners at war style of game. They kind of recognize, where I feel like he's definitely learned from his mistakes from his Game Changers run, and I feel a tad more confident in his ability to play more optimally in the game. Now, ultimately, again, it was never really going to work on this season. At the end of the day, there's just going to be seasons like that for Tony, that there's just not a great group for him, though again, that's really the case with any player, to where ultimately I felt like Tony came off fairly well on this season, didn't make any disastrous mistakes, and again, was still a fun character to bat, to where again, ultimately a fun appearance despite him being, again, a bit less prominent than his previous appearances. Now for episode 5, the merge episode. Again, already in episode 5. But here we do get very brief content from the World Tribe before we get to the merge. Already see Parvati telling Suri that she got the idol and talking about how her threat level's through the roof, because again, she will surely be targeted a lot at the merge. But again, clearly everyone knows that the merge is coming, and we see the World Tribe planning on sticking together for the first vote here, despite the fact that Cass openly talks about not trusting Parvati here. And we proceed to get some very strange content from Suri of her saying she doesn't even like stuff from Australia, which is like very weird. This made the edit. Should have made it very clear that she wasn't going to win, as again, why would they have the winner of a season made for Australians crashing on the home country? But either way, we get to the merge, which happens at the auction, with there being a lot of shock at Tony being gone here, meaning that the only men left in the game by the time the merge phase ends up being Luke and Tommy, which is kind of insane, with every boot up to this point being a guy. And it is revealed here that they are merged, with Parvati, what a shocker, getting the first confessional after the merge, talking about how it's 5v5 and she's nervous because she has the biggest target here and it's going to be a battle to gain dominance. Where very much I felt like this was set up to be kind of a battle similar to like Heroes vs. Villains, and I was hoping we would get this like 5-5-0 and this threat of rocks, though again, that really happens. Also here we do get a Shawnee confessional that was very strange, her bragging about being the first person to make the merge 4 times. When it's like, no, you're not. Like, Ozzy had done it on Survivor US before, and also you're amongst other people that are doing that also on this season, where, again, not an accurate statement. And again, if she was talking specifically about Australian Survivor, well, then she's the only person that could have that statistic. But again, we do see her clearly not being Aussie strong here, talking about how her tribe was about to vote her off, so she's open to go against any of them except for Kirby. But again, as we abundantly make it clear later in the season, it was Janine that ruined the Australians on this season. Either way, we get to the auction with Tommy being excited that it's his first ever auction, to where we get to the first item being a scroll where Tommy goes 500 right away, with Luke also deciding to bid 500 to go to rocks, where again you would assume that this is some sort of advantage in the game. And again, in a 5v5 situation, obviously having an advantage like this would be very powerful, to where it ends up being a 50-50 chance here, with Tommy saying he feels lucky, only for him to not get lucky and Luke win the advantage, even though in retrospect maybe it was a bit lucky. It's not that good of one, where it turns out that what Luke gets is the ability to choose one person to return to camp immediately. Not even getting that person's money, to where, again, this is just very lame that both Tommy and Luke spent all their money to potentially get this, which ends up being a very integral piece of the game, but not in the way that anyone expected. Now, I will say it should have been very obvious that this was a trap here, and that the person that goes back will end up getting an advantage, to where if it was me, I would have either sent myself back or one of my closest allies. Yet instead, Luke decides to send back Parvati, which makes no sense from multiple angles. I mean, this is a spot where, again, sending back Parvati is just giving her a chance to find this advantage, and where even in the world where you don't know that's the case, which again, I don't know how you don't, especially with someone like Luke who has played enough Survivor, and you would think by now has watched enough seasons to know that this will be the case, that again, it would be better to send someone that you trust to have the knowledge of what's back at camp. Well, also, this is just pissing off Parvati. And again, I would also say Parvati doesn't play this well either. Parvati gets upset at Luke for doing this, when again, this is clearly a godsend for Parvati. Again, you should be wanting to go back to camp. And again, like, it makes no sense to make an enemy out of Parvati just for her not to be at the auction, where it's like, I guess, like, there was a chance that she could have bought an advantage later in the game, but like, who really cares? Like, I really just don't understand the rationale here of Luke picking Parvati. It doesn't really make any sense to me. Anyway, the rest of the auction ends up actually kind of being pretty boring, though we do see Shawnee getting an enormous plate of ribs, which look like probably one of the best items from any auction. But we also end up seeing Kirby spending 500 on a covered item that ends up being popcorn, which is lame. Oh, Lisa wins a club sandwich and fries for $40 with no one bidding against her, where it seemed pretty clear that a lot of people were holding out for an advantage. So we do see Sarah ending up bidding $420 on a covered item, hoping that it's a clue to an idol, only for it to be chocolate cake that she can't share. And that's it. That's the auction. So again, that was kind of lame. But obviously we then get content of Parvati returning to camp, complaining about Luke, and also about how she's such a big target, only to find back at camp a jar of cookies and a shovel to bury it, where again, this is a cool little callback here to Jericho's jar of cookies. And we do get a fun little reference here of Parvati saying digging up the sand reminds her of James Clement. But ultimately, again, you would expect the reward here to be something a bit more substantial, especially as she proceeds to drop her jar into the hole that she dug, breaking it and getting sand all over the cookies, which kind of ruins that, even though we know from Express that she actually did still continue to eat them and share them with other players, which is kind of insane. But what really ends up mattering here is that there is more of an advantage to this, and at the bottom of the jar is a note that's revealed to be a knowledge is power, which is just kind of insane that she was just handed this. And I mean, to be fair, I don't know how much of an impact it really has in the game, where while it is like utilized in minute ways following this, it's utilized in ways that don't really change how the game would have played out. But again, just very fortunate, obviously, that Parvati is just handed a knowledge is power here, which I've said this before, but I still just don't like the knowledge is power. I think it's an overpowered advantage, while also just being kind of a dumb advantage in how it forces players to have to tell the truth. Well, also, it's also a spot where other people don't even know it's even an option to be in the game at this point. And I think that also leads to it being a tad unfair, considering obviously we saw this in Brains of Brawn 2, yet they hadn't seen that yet. To where, again, I don't think anyone would have had on their minds that knowledge is power was in play on this season. But again, ultimately, it doesn't really affect too much here. Anyway, we get the others returning to camp, where we do get some pretty surreal interactions here between like Suri and Luke, and like Parvati and Shawnee talking about following each other on Instagram. And we do get like a humorous little interaction between Kirby and Tommy, where he tells her that you're my wife's favorite, only from the reveal that he was Team Ferris. But again, Tommy ends up coming off very endearing here, talking about how he made it to the merge in the Olympics. Finland doesn't win many medals, so if he wins, it'll be their first in 8 years. I wonder if that'll lead to him winning something, at least. Oh, we see Luke, again, talking about how he made an enemy of Parvati right away, but the Australians have his back, because again, they will clearly keep Aussie strong. And we got from that to Kirby and Parvati talking about working together, with Parvati finally actually seeming to play this in a way similar to Russell in Heroes vs. Villains, like telling Kirby that she's been fighting for her life and pretending that she was like aligned with Tony and that she only survived because of her immunity win. And again, you would think that this would be a position where she would utilize this to gain information on the other side, potentially pull over a move similar to what she did in Heroes Villains, only for it actually just to be easier than that and her just to completely win Kirby over, with them now creating a new alliance of Kirby, Shawnee, Parvati, and Suri that Kirby seemed genuinely loyal to, which I will say this is definitely something I would give Parvati a lot of credit for, is pulling over Kirby in this position. The fact that she was able to get Kirby, who again up to this point had probably been the strongest player of this entire season, and got her to essentially take out her own numbers for the sake of working with Parvati, I think is impressive play here. And it's also to the detriment of Kirby, where I really just don't understand Kirby's rationale here outside of just wanting to get to the end with the best. But also, like, why does she want to do that? Where, again, for Kirby here, it's really just her essentially sacrificing her game just for the opportunity to work with Parvati, someone that she didn't even know. And again, I think that definitely adds to this notion just how much charisma Parvati has, where I do think as a whole, I think people do overstate the impact Parvati's charisma has on the game and how much it's helped her in her Survivor career. Yet I do think this is a specific point where, again, this is very clearly Parvati just winning Kirby over when it doesn't benefit Kirby in the slightest to do so. So it is at this point that we do see Kirby throwing Sarah under the bus, saying that Sarah doesn't like big players and would take them out, which is like, you're the same thing. You're the person that literally led the charge against David. But again, clearly sets up Sarah as the one to go here. Oh, we see Sarah also campaigning to Parvati, trying to bond with her over the David connection, and essentially just says the same thing back of saying that Kirby took out David because she hates threats. And really all this just really puts Parvati and Suri in this swing position with the Australians already being extremely fractured and both sides just actively wanting to work with Parvati and Suri, which again, I think you give them some credit for that, obviously. I think there's also just the notion of there are these big legends in the game that people wanted to work with that also benefited them here as well. And also, again, they're the smaller group within the World Tribe in comparison to the Internationals that made them more appealing to work with, where ultimately, again, ends up putting Parvati and Suri in this really dominant position that they're able to really just steamroll the rest of the post-merge from. But either way, we do get to the immunity challenge, which ends up being last gasp. Which, what do you know, doesn't play out as expected, though we do get Lisa being the first out and proceeding to just cough throughout the rest of the challenge, which I found kind of funny. They can just hear coughing in the background, but it does end up starting to storm mid-challenge, where we do see the eliminated players just hiding on their JLP's platform, and it does get to the point where we do have to have Medical stepping in, stopping the challenge. A pretty meta moment here for Australian Survivor, where we do get another endearing Tommy moment here when he's told the challenge was stopped and him thinking that he had won, only to be pissed when he told what was going on. But they end up not being able to continue the challenge after the storm due to the grates being underwater, which I do question, like, why not just make them hold their breath underwater the longest and make that determine the winner? But either way. Instead, what they decide to do here is give the remaining players that were left in the challenge a choice of either having no one get immunity or do a random draw to decide who gets immunity. A choice that isn't that much of a choice. I mean, it's just kind of obvious. You should just go for the ram chance. I mean, why not just, again, open up the opportunity for you to get immunity, especially considering it's even odds here. It was 2 world members, 2 Australia members. There was not really any like numbers reason to not go through this. And again, I think if you're not willing to create another challenge here, this is a fair enough way to handle this, as at the end of the day, it's not like this matters too much. Anyway, Tommy finally gets lucky here and finally gets immunity this time around, saying 3rd time's a charm, where somehow Tommy and actually Luke as well had been involved in 3 rock draws over the last couple days. But anyway, back at camp, ends up being raining so hard, and you can just really tell just how miserable the players are during the scramble here. Here we do see the initial plans come together. The Internationals planning on voting for Janine and wanting to cause a 5-5 tie and getting Ozzy to flip on the revote. Always see Luke talking about keeping Ozzy strong and planning on putting all their votes on the Cass. All Sarah ends up creating a plan to spread Lisa's name in the case of an idol. To reduce here, going to Parvati and Suri, telling them the Lisa plan, only for Shawnee to instantly reveal to them that's a fake plan. And talking about solidifying her relationship with Parvati, saying it's the Shantent people want, which I guess she's technically right about that. Though, again, it does feel like the edit tried to show this as like her true intention was to be loyal to Parvati, when the reality is from her exit press, she was talking about how she really just wanted to work with them for this one vote and was planning on flipping on them immediately afterwards, as we literally see on the next episode, where again, it is kind of weird how it feels like the edit wanted to try to sell this like Parvati-Shawnee relationship only for that to just go nowhere. And I will say, like, I do think for Shawnee, on paper, her plan is a good one. For her, again, being on the bottom of the Australian group and having Sarah who's directly coming after her, again, getting rid of Sarah first, then flipping back, working with the Internationals to take out the other bigger threats in Parvati and Suri, again, is a good plan on paper. The problem is that she obviously didn't really have the connections to enact that plan. And the internationals were sadly just more loyal to Parvati and Suri than they ever were to her. But here we do end up seeing Kirby getting Parvati on board with voting for Sarah. Though Parvati does say it's a red flag that Kirby wants to blindside her former closest ally, which is obviously why this is not a great play from Kirby for her to be flipping against her Aussie group to a group that doesn't really want her either, with Suri also talking about how dangerous she is. So again, it was clear this is setting this up as a bad move for Kirby. Again, burning her OG allies, not even gaining new solid allies through it. But again, this plan does come together with Suri actually trying to get the internationals on board for voting for Sarah as well, only for them to not get on board, seemingly being worried that they're being tricked into splitting their votes, which, to be fair, is a very reasonable read, as again, if Kirby was playing optimally here, that would be what they would be doing. To where the internationals end up keeping their votes onto Janine, which I assume was an intended split by that point, as again, they knew the real vote was onto Sarah, though that doesn't get properly explained on the show. But it's also here where we actually do see Kirby warning Luke that Sarah is going to go home here, telling him that Parvati and Suri want Sarah out, only for Luke to be shocked and say it's too early, and that if you do that, you're next, where, again, he's not wrong, saying that he's trying to stop Kirby from doing something crazy, when it's like, again, in reality, you don't really try enough. So we get the tribal, where it did seem like the Aussie contingent was still expecting a 5-5 vote for whatever reason, while Lisa seemingly tries to get Suri to switch her vote off of Sarah, again, being worried that the other side would play an idol for her, but again, it doesn't happen. Sarah ends up being voted out here in a 4-3 vote, which is kind of insane. In one of the few positions where the spoilers were wrong coming into the season, where, again, the entire boot list was out there for this season. However, post-merge slots that were incorrect, this boot being one of them, though by the time it happened, it was pretty clear that Sarah was going to be booted, where essentially what happened is that Kirby and Sarah were switched. But again, there was no real setup to the vote actually flipping onto Kirby itself. So again, by the time we got the tribal, it felt pretty apparent that Sarah is being set up for the fall here. And Sarah's someone that I thought was pretty fun on this season. I mean, she was my winner pick coming in this season, and I will say if she were to play again, I probably wouldn't pick her as my winner pick again, as again, I do think she's just really just showing this ability to be sloppy no matter how she attempts to play the game. And she's someone that, again, definitely has skills for the game. I mean, definitely is someone that is very knowledgeable about the game, is a very active player, but just seems to make the incorrect calls at almost every turn. And I really just feel like she played this season all wrong, yet she somehow made the merge still, was the first juror. And again, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing Sarah play again at some point down the road, though obviously, again, from a gameplay perspective, this is a pretty lacking performance, even though I actually do feel like she was a pretty fun presence on the season with how much we saw her struggling for decision making. But over episode 6, another pretty strong episode here, probably one of the strongest from a storytelling perspective, though we do start off with Luke talking about how crazy it is that he tried to be Australia strong, but that's not the case anymore. Says to Kirby, why didn't you tell me? Which is like, I mean, she pretty much did. I mean, I guess she didn't specifically say that, yeah, I have the numbers and this is exactly happening, but she did literally tell you that, yeah, Sarah is being targeted and that Parvati and Suri were on board. But either way, Luke says that he's done with Kirby and only trusts Janine. Where Edit does go all in here on blaming Kirby for the fall of the Australians, despite the fact that, obviously, again, it was Janine. I don't know if you noticed. This is all while we get Kirby talking about how Parvati is now her ride or die, and she wants to sit at the end against the best, with Parvati seeming apprehensive here to Kirby, saying that she created the flirt game and knows when it's happening to her, when it's like, again, I don't think this was a game for Kirby. Again, it did seem like Parvati did not fully trust Kirby, though at least did recognize the fact that Kirby was a pretty good number for her in particular at this point in the game, though also someone that, again, how can you really trust her too much when she just turned on Sarah, her former number one? Now, again, at the end of the day, again, that is a bad read, as, again, it seemed like Kirby was actually loyal to Parvati, though at the same time, it's like, how do you really know that when you're on the island, especially when you have this direct evidence against her? Despite the fact that Kirby does openly talk about wanting to go to the final 3 with Parvati and Suri, it felt pretty clear this alliance was going to stick for too much longer. But again, this allows Parvati to really gloat about her positioning once again, talking about her connection with Shawnee, that again doesn't matter, also talking about having the OG girl alliance. Also proceeds to not trust her anymore and recognize they're on the out. So again, what a great position. Either way, this is where we finally start to get some content here revolving around Janine. They're saying that Kirby put the Australians on the bottom and now they have the scramble. Or do you see her and Luke talk about needing to divide and conquer, which seems to essentially be what they do. It does seem like Luke latches on to Shawnee and attempts to work with the internationals, all while Janine here puts more work into Parvati and Suri, talking about wanting to work with them, and tells Parvati that Cass has been saying things behind her back, that they need to take the threats out, which we don't see happen. I don't know if this is something that like literally happened and Janine is just telling the truth, or if she just made this up out of nowhere. But again, like we know that Cass seems to be distrusting of Parvati, but we never actually see proof that this actually happened from Janine. But Parvati buys it all up and talks about Cass is now public enemy number 1, is now our target. So again, I wonder who won immunity in that spot, especially because this is right before the immunity challenge. But a spot where I don't even think this is necessarily the incorrect call for Parvati. I do think Cass is actually a pretty decent target for her. Again, probably the only person that could beat her in endurance competitions, while also somebody that is, again, distrusting her and clearly has the abilities to be a big player of her own, where, again, I do actually think this is not a terrible call from her, even though it's, again, seemingly based around not the most accurate information. But either way, we do get to the immunity challenge, it being an endurance challenge, them having to hold up 2 beams that are a percentage of their body weight, with the winner also getting a reward in the form of a scroll that they open the next morning, which is very weird. Anyway, very clear here that Parvati or Cass are going to win this, as, again, they're going to win every endurance challenge. Also, very funny that you could just tell how they built this challenge to go super quick, where people are, like, barely even able to hold the beams up from the very beginning, and almost everyone ends up dropping out within the first 5 minutes until we obviously get to Cass versus Parvati. Again, I can't believe it. There is a funny little moment here of JLP mentioning the deal that they had previously made, only for Parvati to say, shush. But ultimately, Cass ends up just legitimately winning this challenge here. Again, what a shocker based on editing. So it is following this that we do see Cass and Parvati talk it out, revealing that she's heard that you've been saying my name, and Cass is shocked at that, saying that's not true. Which, again, we don't know if it was or not. But with Cass now having immunity, we see Parvati and Kirby still talking about splitting up the internationals, agreeing on voting for Lisa for some reason. I don't know why they don't vote for Tommy. Now, I guess technically Lisa isn't a terrible target for Parvati also, considering Lisa's connection to Suri, and that would separate Suri. But also, again, like, Tommy's just kind of a target there that you have no connection to. But it is here where we do get a lot of focus around Parvati promising to Kirby that she'll never write her name down. And again, I wonder if she'll have to go back on that very quickly. But in the midst of all this, we then finally cut back to Shawnee now, talking about how she's not dumb and she sees that her 4-person alliance isn't a long-time thing, to which we do see her proceeding to talk to Luke, with them now planning to work with the internationals and turn to vote against Parvati and Suri, which really almost everybody should be doing, which they end up being ineffective in doing so, where it felt like the internationals were not ready just yet to turn against the World Tribe, though considering again, all the advantage we know Parvati has, and also the influence that Parvati and Suri have on specific individuals, again, the move should have been taken in this spot. And we do see Luke again campaigning to the internationals, talking about going on a world trip, going to Quebec and Finland and wherever the other person lives, which is funny considering at least it's the only person of the 3 that he knew beforehand, where we know that he watched NZ Thailand. He's literally done podcasts about it. But again, this is a spot where they clearly should be taking a shot at Parvati, though instead Luke decides to pitch Kirby's name, which, I mean, to be fair, would be a very easy name for the world to go after, while also being someone that at this point clearly is not really an ally for you, to where, again, it's not a terrible target, though. It's funny that, again, the internationals end up going that way, but just end up doing it without Luke by the time it happens, especially as he later shifts his target onto Suri, which was clearly never happening, and I don't think Lisa would have turned on Suri at this point. And also, even beyond that, why Suri instead of Parvati? I don't think that really made much sense, as I feel like the internationals were much more likely to turn on Parvati than Suri. As again, it seemed like Suri just had very good relations with the internationals, to where, again, we do see Luke and Shawnee end up voting for Suri, thinking that they had the internationals on board, which was supposedly Shawnee's plan all along. But again, it's just a spot where they just did not do enough of the legwork to actually make this go through. And this is when we then cut back to Janine, who joins Suri and Kirby, with Kirby telling them about the plan to go for Lisa, and Suri clearly being annoyed at that. To where once she leaves, we see Janine proceeding to campaign against Kirby, clearly being on board here, talking about not knowing where Kirby stands due to betraying her own people, and Janine really getting a lot of credit for masterminding this, despite the fact that I think Kirby was actually probably going to be the target anyway. But again, really good on Janine to really build this bond of Suri and Parvati that ends up really dominating the rest of the season. I think this is something that, again, Janine deserves a lot of credit for. I actually think this leads to her essentially being the best player of the season outside of Parvati and Suri. The fact that she was able to go from being on the bottom here to cultivating what ends up being the strongest alliance of the entire season, and getting Parvati and Suri to pick her over literally everyone else in the game to take to the end. To her, while obviously she loses at the end, the thing is, like, I think Janine probably loses at the end against anybody anyway, so it doesn't really matter. To where I think the fact that she was able to shape the end game in her vision, essentially, from the position that she was in, is, again, impressive play here. Though, again, it is at this point that we do see Suri doing a lot of the legwork for this plan, being the one to tell Cass and Lisa to vote for Kirby, while Cass ends up revealing to her that Luke and Shawnee are pitching her, where, again, just very clear that Cass was still loyal to Suri in this position, though we do see them also being distrusting of Janine, but Suri says that she trusts her, with this again being very similar to the previous round, with again the worry that an idol might be played on the name that they're being given, though again the plan does end up going through here in a spot where they actually don't even need Parvati's vote in this position, where they have the majority either way, though they obviously do want to get Parvati on board, with her later getting on board, but it's obviously not the correct call for Parvati's game, where again she clearly didn't even want Kirby to go out in this spot, and it is very detrimental for her game. Again, Kirby's just another option for her. Now without her, she has to put a lot more trust into Lisa and Cass. And also at that point, it would be, again, the definitive biggest threat in the game, to where we have Parvati saying that this is the hottest pickle she's ever been in, which is a nice little callback. But she says she doesn't want to burn Kirby or Suri, when it's like, I mean, there are other options. Though again, it's a spot where, despite the fact that, again, Parvati comes out of this game playing a very dominant game, and when that is potentially one of the best of all time, there are, again, still spots like this where she doesn't really get her way and is pretty ineffective in getting what she wanted done here. To where we do see her campaigning to try to keep Kirby for a bit here, to which Kirby ends up noticing and becomes nervous, seeing all the scrambling, saying she feels like a jealous girlfriend, and notices that Parvati's now being different, with her ending up mentioning her insecurities from Ferris, saying that he would play the idol on her only to not do so, almost as if Parvati would have the exact same opportunity here, not do it also. But again, nice callback that also I didn't realize just how much Kirby was seemingly hurt by that, where it felt like she took it in stride at the time. But again, this does lead to Parvati talking about how she can play her idol on Kirby, and it'll be like her being Khaleesi with Kirby as her dragon, and she'll be making an offering to secure the beast, only to not do that anyway. And to be fair, she shouldn't do that. I don't know why you would do that, to waste your idol on this. So obviously the ideal would have been just her having the influence to stir the votes away from Kirby, but again, in the spot where Kirby's getting the votes anyway, again, it's not really worth saving her. She isn't as important of a number, though where while she is someone loyal to you, again, there's enough doubt there to where, again, it's not really worth going all in on this relationship there. But either way, we do get the tribal, which ends up being pretty mundane, though I did like them including Cass getting to talk about the added difficulty of playing not in your native language, which feels very not Australian Survivor coded to have that being shown on the show. But the rest of tribal ends up seemingly being very revolved around Kirby, with GLP constantly bringing up the Sarah vote to the point where Kirby gets annoyed at him for how much he's bringing it up. But ultimately, again, we get to the vote where Luke and Shani end up voting for Suri, with Luke spelling it Serre somehow. Oh, Kirby votes for Lisa, and Janine ends up voting for Kirby here, saying she's doing this for David. So ultimately, Parvati doesn't play her idol here, and Kirby ends up being blindsided in a 6-2-1 vote, with her clearly being hurt by Parvati on her way out. And us seeing Luke giving a big reaction here, despite the fact that, again, supposedly he was told about this plan before Tribal, that Janine told him last second. Though, again, they were trying to pretend like they weren't as close as what they really were, and I wonder if this is him playing into that, though ultimately, again, it doesn't matter too much. But either way, with that, we end up losing Kirby. And Kirby's someone that, again, played a major impact on this season. I think for the first half of this season, she was playing probably the best game of the season. Again, her move to take out David at that first vote is still pretty insane. Again, the fact that she was able to get David's friend for years to flip on him, again, is very impressive play there, especially coming from someone that it's a relative unknown coming into this season. And I feel like Kirby is someone that made the most of that early on, only to then just kind of sacrifice that at the end to work with Parvati. Though again, she still was a really interesting player on this season. I think my actual opinion of her as a player did go up from watching her on this season. For obviously, I think we know a lot more about her weaknesses in the game, particularly her having some optimal decision making on who exactly to align with. It does feel like Kirby is just able to build a lot of influence in the game and played a fairly impressive game for the short period of time she was there, to where ultimately, again, I felt like this was something that really just boosted her legacy in my eyes. Another episode 7, probably the last truly good episode of the season in my eyes, where, as I mentioned before, I do feel like this is a season that kind of peters off towards the end. I do think the last 3 episodes of the season in particular were just kind of a steamroll, and were just leading to a very obvious result, where this is the last episode that felt like it had some very fluid gameplay within it, to where we do start off with Luke instantly doing damage control for voting for Suri, telling her it was the internationals that were coming after her, and he was just going along. Obviously a lie, but a lie that does work. Not necessarily because Suri actually believes it, but it does give her enough reason to think that she can work with him, especially considering his connection to Janine, where again, it very much feels like Janine is this linchpin here, keeping this group together, as we later see, again, Suri, Parvati, Janine, and Luke become the 4-person alliance that runs the show, and again, a lot of that felt like it was happening because of Janine. But following this, we do get Cass opening her scroll from winning the immunity challenge, which turns out to actually just be a reward, because obviously, like, with the schedule of the season, they don't really have time to actually do, like, individual reward challenges. So, again, they just give her a reward to a spa and pick 3 people to go with her, where she ends up picking Parvati, Suri, and Tommy to try to secure this world alliance, even though she probably should be taking a shot at them at this point. Though, again, it feels like she probably waited like a tad too long to start to set up that move. Though, we do see Shawnee here being annoyed to not go here, and knowing that Lisa is there to keep tabs on them, to where this ends up seemingly further bonding the Australians together, making them stick Australia strong once again. To which we do get a moment of them noticing that the box is still at camp, to where Shawnee says, should we just smash it open? To where Luke does, and find out it's empty, to where now they know that someone on the other side has a power that leads to Shawnee saying confessional that we might be screwed, where again, riveting content there. All at the spa, we do get some overconfident cast content talking about how she can win challenges and has an idol and feels confident about her guests, which clearly felt like a setup to a fall, to where she does plan on sticking with Suri and Parvati for the next vote at least, with Cass telling them it was Luke's idea to vote Suri, where now obviously becomes a he said, she said, with Cass actually telling the truth in this spot, but we do see him ultimately end up agreeing to vote for Shawnee in this position, which isn't properly explained, especially considering, again, supposedly Parvati has a really good relationship with Shawnee, but again, it's really a spot here where it did seem to be largely based around that Janine connection. But it is here we do get a pretty great moment of Suri and Parvati sitting in the hammock, with Parvati telling her about the idol stealer she has, and Suri saying that they could finally be sitting in the finals together, which will only be tragic. But anyway, we get to the immunity challenge, it being a stacking competition where they also have to cross a balance beam and fill up a bucket of water along the way, because they obviously had to make this even more physical, to where Tommy ends up really just dominating his challenge from the beginning and pulls out the win here. To where right away at camp, we do see the World Tribe members going off, confirming the vote onto Shawnee, and proceeding to agree to not tell the Australians a name. Oh, we see the Australians now seemingly working in lockstep, though it is here we see the internationals talking on their own, with Tommy now saying it's the perfect time to go for Parvati, because he needs something on his resume and needs to break up Sri and Parvati, which is 100% the correct game plan that Lisa ends up not being on board with. Even saying that she wants Parvati gone, but just seemingly doesn't want to make the move now, which I really don't understand why they were waiting so long to make this move. I guess, to be fair, making this move at 8 could lead to the internationals being outnumbered at 7 and have the shot taken at them then, but it still feels like a spot where you have to break up Parvati and Suri at some point, especially knowing that they have an idol. And for Lisa in particular, she would be able to pick up Suri once Parvati's gone, where again, this should be a no-brainer, yet she doesn't want to do the move here. Yet, despite that, is also the one to then proceed to tell Shawnee and Luke to vote for Parvati, supposedly last second, like right before Tribal, where we do know from Exit Press that they were never actually going to go through this move against Parvati, that, again, Lisa not being on board essentially shut it down, though it does make you question, like, why is Lisa doing this? Like, I really just don't understand why Lisa even went to Luke and Shawnee and told them to vote for Parvati. It just feels like sloppy play here that's just really unnecessary if you aren't going through with the move, especially because she even tells them that she herself isn't voting for Parvati. So again, it's just very strange how this was handled. And obviously this doesn't show any trust here with Luke and Shawnee, who leave this conversation not trusting Lisa, wanting to flip the vote onto her instead, even though again for them they should also be trying to get Parvati and Suri out. But this all leads to Parvati watching this conversation, now thinking that Lisa is the one leading this vote against her, where again, funny that this is technically a misread in the sense that Lisa's actually the one to stir the votes away from her and actually stop the flip. But again, coming in the Tribal, we do see Parvati being sketched out, leading into probably one of the most hectic Tribals of the season that really ends up taking a bulk of the episode, though obviously the double Tribal plays a factor into that. And we get the Tribal where it turns into a live Tribal right away, with Luke and Janine whispering and agreeing to switch the vote onto Lisa, while Parvati pulls over Cass, talking on the side, asking her if she's voting for her or Suri, and Cass saying she's not, which again, she is technically telling the truth here. But this leads to Parvati saying that she's nervous and decides to pull out her idol and puts it around her neck, which is again another very Hansian move for her to make here, saying that she's playing it for her or Suri, with this really just sketching out Cass even more, asking for keeping the same plan, only for Parvati to say no chance and that Lisa's been sketchy. with Lisa saying, I'm the one that hasn't been, which is, again, not fully true because she literally was saying Parvati's name. But again, it's still a spot where she was the one to actually stop it from actually landing on Parvati. But again, we see Cass telling her that we're voting for Shawnee, only Parvati says she's not buying it. Where, again, as impressive as I do feel like Parvati plays this tribal and as much as it works to her benefit, it does, again, largely come from a misread. It does feel like she kind of got to the right place for the wrong reasons, where she got it because of her not trusting Lisa and Cass in a spot where, like, they actually were with her at this specific point. And again, we do see Luke really playing into this. Actually, again, playing this round pretty well here and, like, saying that Lisa and Cass were coming for you. And Parvati say, I knew it. Again, just further allowing Parvati to believe what, again, wasn't true here. But again, just further turning this into a he said, she said, with Luke and Jean definitely exaggerating the truth here. Again, Parvati and Suri just buying it up here. Suri saying she hasn't caught Luke in a lie yet, which is like, I mean, technically you haven't caught Lisa or Cass in a lie yet either. But this does lead to Luke telling Suri that we should vote for Lisa now, with Suri surprisingly being on board here, where just in general, for Suri in particular, a shot against Lisa or Cass isn't great for Suri, as it's really a spot where they have a much better relationship with Suri than to Parvati, where it's obviously a much better move for Parvati. And again, Lisa in particular is such a bad target for Suri, and it seemed like a spot where Lisa was about to go until Parvati decides to shift the plan last second onto Cass instead, which is the correct call here. I mean, obviously, again, if the other side were to play an idol, they would play an idol on Lisa, thinking that Lisa was the target. Well, also, Cass is, again, just such a good target for Parvati in particular in terms of getting rid of somebody that can beat you in that final endurance challenge. To reduce Lisa here trying to do some damage control with Parvati, with her now fully putting the blame onto Tommy, which is the rightful place to put the blame on, only for Parvati to tell her it's not you tonight and just vote for Shawnee, which does lead to Cass and Lisa actually switching their votes last second to Luke, essentially being a minority vote split here that ends up, again, not really mattering. But again, had Cass ended up playing her idol correctly, it actually would have led to Luke going home here based on them switching her votes here. But either way, we get to the votes where we do see Cass ending up going to play her idol, obviously due to all the hecticness that was going on, to which Parvati says, actually, and pulls out her knowledge is power and starts reading a note saying that she can take Cass's idol, but then proceeding to not read the final line that says it has to be played before the votes are cast, where she does proceed to bluff as if she can still take Cass's idol, which ends up being an effective play here. Though I don't love that this is a thing that you can do. I mean, very similar to like Tony's Tyler Perry idol. I just don't like the notion of people not knowing the full rules of the game. And while, again, I do give credit to Tony and I give credit to Parvati here for using the advantage in an innovative way, I do think the knowledge imbalance between the players here just is something that I wish was a bit more balanced. Though I will say, at first, I too was bluffed that Parvati could actually use this power at this point, as, again, I would not put it past Australian Survivor Production to mess up something like that and mess up the timing of this advantage. Though obviously it does actually function very similar to knowledge's power in that it can only be played before the votes are cast, which is something that even Parvati did not know, where supposedly she pulled out the advantage fully thinking that she could take Cass's idol until getting to that final line and realizing she was mistaken, only to then, again, be able to effectively bluff from that point forward, which, again, very impressive on that. But again, kind of funny that it was built on, again, her just actually making a mistake at first. I do feel like this is something that people will call out as like Parvati's best move of the entire season, when really it's something that like doesn't really matter, as at the end of the day, Cass was never playing the idol for herself anyway. She was always going to play it on Lisa. So it's not like she particularly tricked Cass into doing something against her best interest by doing this. To where really the more the benefits that happen from this come after the fact with Luke, though even then she doesn't really make the most of the opportunity either, to where ultimately, again, it doesn't actually really matter that much here. Though I think it's a spot where she initially does actually just make a mistake in exposing her advantage, only to then actually make the most of it following that. Though again, from Cass's point of view, this should have been very see-through in how Parvati is operating around this. Again, pretending like she was going to steal her idol, but then when Cass says that she's going to play it on Lisa for Parvati to back down, which it's like, why would she do that? Unless it was a spot where she couldn't actually steal the advantage, as this makes no sense for Parvati to not just steal the idol in this position, no matter who she's playing it for. But also the fact that she's not worried about you playing the idol on Lisa should be, again, a very clear tell that she didn't vote for Lisa, which, again, should have made Cass recognize that, okay, maybe there's a chance she voted for me instead. Though, again, she doesn't fully think that through. So, again, this really shouldn't have worked, but obviously considering how last second this was and how tough it was to really think through this situation, I don't really blame Cass too much for this. Though again, it does lead to a humorous situation here of Cass playing the idol on Lisa, only for the votes to land on her. Again, a very rare situation in Survivor. Though the episode doesn't end just yet, as JLP now reveals that we're voting again. And they're going to do another immunity challenge right outside the tribal, which has become obviously an Australian Survivor trope, which I do find it very weird they decided to do a double elim here in a spot where they actually do have an extra day following this with nothing happening, to where they could have just done another round during that day. Now, theoretically, that would expand the episode count, though you could also mix those two episodes into one, though I guess this is easier for them to do. But again, just kind of weird that they decided to just do an immediate elimination following this. But again, we end up seeing another challenge here of them having to use a rope to balance a table and bounce balls on it. Again, a pretty boring one, but it allows for JLP to give his typical ball innuendos. So again, boring challenge. Luke easily wins here, to where we do get back to tribal, to where we do see the jury again having waited, and Cass also coming in after the challenge, where I do find all this very weird. Well, I still understand why the jury's not allowed to watch the challenge. I also found it weird that Cass wasn't with the rest of the jury until after the challenge, but either way, it's pretty apparent what's going to happen here, where Parvati just openly talks about how she's voting for Tommy at this point, with Tommy saying, "What the heck, guys, we had a good thing," only for Parvati to call him out for trying to blindside her, which is again very fair. Though I do love how much gusto Tommy has in his final moments here, pitching to the Australians, saying Parvati has all the advantages and we might as well play together, where again, straight up, Tommy is right here in his arguments. I do think it's in almost everyone's best interest to take the shot against Parvati and Suri at this point, especially if you want to win the game, to allowing Parvati to get to the final 6 with an idol and acknowledges power and also a locked in ally is just kind of insane. Though we do see the Australian group just not really do anything with that and decide to just keep it simple, which is really bad for Shawnee in particular, who's clearly on the bottom of that group, where at least for Luke and Janine, again, this is nearly securing a spot in the final 4 for them. Well, with Shawnee, it's really just actively putting herself on the bottom in a spot where she really should have made a move in this position. Now, I will say, I do think they were definitely disfavored by the fact that this was not a full round. They did not have a lot of time to be thinking about this vote, especially considering they didn't even know that Cass would be gone right away. So it's not like they had this full forethought of how the game was going to be playing out, to where, again, I do give them a little bit of leniency there, though again, it should have been fairly clear cut here that the move needed to be taken at this point. And realistically, I don't think it would have really mattered anyway, as I think ultimately Luke and Janine probably would have stuck with Parvati and Sri anyway, based on how they played the rest of the season. But either way, we get to the time to vote. But this is where Lisa decides to speak up, saying she has something to say, to which it is pouring raining at this point, which is pretty resonant, as we have Lisa proceed to say that last time she won but regretted not staying by her people, and tonight she wants to, by quitting the game to save Tommy, which I know a lot of people are very frustrated at. However, this is something that for me, again, while yes, it is lame to see someone want to leave, especially on a season of this high caliber, I also do fully get it from a personal standpoint. I mean, once you've won Survivor, coming back, I feel like you don't really have that drive to win again. I mean, especially in a spot where you know you're in a losing position. I mean, we literally saw this with Ben Driebergen in Winners at War, where again, I fully get his rationale there of not wanting to go to the end and be lambasted by the jury, and he would rather just use his elimination to try to help an ally of his. And again, it feels like Lisa was essentially just doing the same thing, wanting to help out Tommy and have Tommy stay in the game, only for JLP to essentially talk her out of it, saying that if you quit, you're not going to be on the jury and that we will still vote. It's like, there's no way they would still vote following this. And maybe they would still vote, but again, it won't be for elimination. But again, it ends up leading to Lisa backing down here. So ultimately, we see Tommy leading the vote against Suri, because they always vote for Suri. Oh, Lisa clearly ends up not wanting to, and instead ends up voting for Janine. Oh, everyone else votes for Tommy, leading to Luke obviously gloating about being the last man standing. But with that, we obviously lost 2 people in this episode. Somehow both of the more fairly unknown players coming in this season. Let's talk about them. First up, talking about Cass. And again, Cass is someone that I thought actually had a pretty solid season here. I mean, despite the fact that she's obviously eliminated Final 8, I feel like she actually came off fairly well here. Obviously finding an idol, winning challenges. Probably the international here that had the most respect if she were to somehow get to the end, where I think Cass played a solid game here. Definitely seemed to gain a potential killer instinct, at least talked about making the move. And while again, she never does, and I do still falter for that. I think she waited a bit too long to make the move against Parvati and Suri. It's still a spot where I at least give her some credit here for recognizing what she should do at some point. Though I also felt like she was a fun character on the show. I thought she had some fun confessionals at points, and just overall came off fairly likable here. And with that, let's move on to Tommy, who also came off very likable on the show here. Again, definitely had some very endearing moments. Now, in comparison to Cass, I don't feel he played as strong of a game, and mind you, again, he came into this being a bit disadvantaged. Didn't really have as many natural allies for him. Though Tommy is someone that, again, on his original season, I thought he was a very skilled player, and here, where I at least respect the fact that he at least tried to make the shot at the end. And I do think he had the correct game plan in mind. I do think the fact that he was really leading this charge that we need to take out Parvati is at least something I'll give him some credit for, even though, again, he was largely ineffective in the game. Though, again, another one that I thought came off very likable here, was a very endearing presence, even though he was severely under-edited across the season. But now for episode 8, easily the worst episode of the season, and really where the season, again, kind of starts to die, where it is so clear that Lisa's going home the entire time, with no real doubt throughout the entire episode. So we literally do get content at the beginning here about Lisa being on the bottom and a montage of her walking on the beach by herself and being the last to eat rice, with this being, again, a fairly meta moment of Lisa talking about how that's what people typically do when they're on the bottom. And again, Lisa's just such a clear target at this point, despite the fact that it actually benefits pretty much nobody to be getting her out at this point. It doesn't really benefit Parvati and Suri, as again, it gives the Australians the numbers for the following round. It doesn't really benefit the Australians, as it keeps Parvati and Suri in the game, two people that they can't beat at the end, where ultimately, again, it doesn't really benefit anybody to get rid of Lisa at this point. Yeah, again, everyone's on board with it. Which is, again, kind of what's lame about this endgame here, is the fact that, again, it really just feels like this 4-person alliance just sticks together. And while there are points where they consider doing something, they never actually do. And it feels like a spot here where it's kind of just a blown opportunity, especially for players of this caliber. Again, these are some of the best players of all time, and for them to just be kind of resigned and not really even doing much to better their position for the endgame is just very lame. Anyway, we see Lisa trying to talk it out with Parvati once again, still telling her that it was Tommy's idea. But it doesn't really go particularly well, with Lisa claiming that she was always going to tell her, only for Parvati to say, but you didn't. And Lisa to then outwardly admit that, yeah, I did want you out eventually, as everyone does, and if they don't, they're lying. Which, about that. So we then see Lisa pitching to Luke that Parvati is the biggest player here, which she seemed to be using more so to just kind of trap him into say something that she could use against him, which she doesn't do by the end of this conversation, as this conversation also doesn't end up going well, with it actually just leading to them targeting each other, with him saying that Lisa isn't good for his game, as she thinks he's a big threat and she wouldn't take him to the end, which, again, true, though clearly he thought he was a bigger jury threat than what he really was, which really plays into this entire endgame. The fact that Luke seemingly just believed that he needed to get to the end and he would just automatically win, which, again, had been the case for the previous 2 seasons he had been on, but this is a different season. This is a season where you're with Parvati and Suri, 2 of the biggest legends of the game, who had been completely running the game while you've been on the bottom the entire time. Again, it's a spot here where Luke just seemed to not really recognize the outlook on the jury and just how he not really have the respect that he did have on his previous season, which again sadly leads to this being a fairly stale game, as again Luke never makes the move despite the fact that he very much should be. Where do you see Luke planning on sticking to the 4 and saying that if Lisa wins immunity then they'll vote out Shawnee, which is really dumb, talking about Shawnee as if she's the biggest jury threat, which I don't fully get why exactly. And again, it just feels like Janine and Luke just are resigned to going to the end with Parvati and Suri, which is just so misguided for them. But we do get to the immunity challenge, during which we do get a flashback to Luke losing the Final 4 immunity challenge during his last season, because it turns out to be the exact same challenge. Essentially, just a physical version of Samotion, with a lot of focus on if Luke will get redemption, and what do you know, he does. I can't believe that Luke won an extremely physical challenge here against the likes of Suri and Shawnee and Lisa and Janine. It is at this point that we see Luke again fully going all in on wanting Lisa out, talking about needing her out to make Suri loyal, which I guess fair. And obviously, again, it's definitely better to get rid of Lisa than it is Shawnee. Like, that's undeniable. But again, the target should be Parvati or Suri. Though even then, it's not even like he's making this move for the right reasons, as again, he should be doing this so that Shawnee's at 5, so that the Australians have the numbers, only for them to just not utilize her anyway. So it is at this point that we do get Janine talking about being worried that she'll go out at 6 like last time, which does lead to Suri saying, me too. And then says, without any votes, linked to her retelling the story about Advantage Geddon, which leads to Lisa saying, I can't hear this story, and walks away, which is a funny little moment. But it does lead to Suri talking about having a tight 4, but she likes keeping her options open, except in her marriage, but does want Lisa to stay here, as she should, where there really is no reason for Suri to be letting Lisa go at this point. It actually feels like very much a losing move here, where after getting rid of Lisa, it really locks her into going to the end against Parvati in a spot where Parvati does beat her. And even then, even going to Final 4, Parvati is very dangerous, considering Parvati is essentially just an auto win in that final endurance challenge at this point, to where at that point, it's again, either you're at the end with her or you're potentially going to fire making. In a spot where obviously we know Suri is so great at fire making. So again, I think it makes no sense for her, and even for Parvati, I do think this is maybe a bit questionable to again allow the Australians to get the numbers coming into the following round. And it seems to all stem from the fact that he trusted Janine so much. And to be fair, again, they had reason to trust Janine to 4 at least. But even then, even for Suri, again, it felt like she felt so confident in his plan because she thought that Janine was going to be voting with her at 4, which again, even that would still lead to a loss because she'll lose against Parvati. But again, it does feel like Janine just very openly just tricks Parvati and Suri into thinking that she's fully loyal to him, which again, good on Janine for that. But this does lead to Lisa starting her pitch here, first pitching to Shawnee, trying to get her to flip against Janine to open up room in the final 3, where Janine's so openly talked about as a GOAT at this point that everyone wants to take to the end, despite the fact that kind of shifts in the following round, which is weird. But this then leads to Lisa saying that if she can't win, the best thing she could do is try to set things up better for Suri, where she wants Suri to win Survivor more than anything in the world, proceeding to try to get Suri and Parvati on board of taking out Janine as well, only for that to, again, go nowhere, which again, credit to Janine for that. But again, at this point, fairly obvious Lisa's going home, though we do get a side plot here that ultimately doesn't really matter, though it is a pretty big moment here of Luke and Parvati both having very questionable play here in different ways here, but Luke saying that he's relying on his idol to make it to final 5 and knows that Parvati has the knowledge is power, which could lead to her taking his idol where he'll be powerless, where it seems like he's under the assumption that Parvati is able to steal the idol at the time that he's using it, which again plays into that information imbalance earlier, though again, I guess credit to Parvati the fact that she bought his bluff, to where he decides to counter that by telling her he has an idol, which is actually counterproductive, as obviously this just now allows her to steal his idol, where sure, that is what I personally would have done in this spot. I do think if I was Parvati, I think the move would be to keep Lisa, steal Luke's idol, take out Janine, have 2 idols for the final 5 round to save you and Suri, and would also split up a duo before the final 4, making it less likely you go into fire, to where again, all this just seems to make a lot of sense, yet Parvati doesn't go through with that. So to be fair, I can at least get the notion of getting Lisa out here, especially take away an option from Suri, though again, ultimately that doesn't really matter, as at this point actually, if she has 2 idols at 5, nothing really matters, as her and Suri are guaranteed to get through that round anyway, and she's essentially an auto-lock to win final immunity anyway, to where again, she's essentially already had the game won. But either way, all this leads to really the master plan from Luke here, in that he's telling her he has an idol to gain trust and to try to get her to rip up her advantage, which she doesn't do right away, as I mean, she really shouldn't, only for Luke to keep pestering her, telling her that ripping it up secures them in the final 3 somehow. So eventually Parvati does cave in, and I really don't understand why she did this. Now, obviously, again, yes, it secures this final 4 alliance a bit more, but ultimately, again, it's a spot here where none of this matters. Where I did feel like this was really suboptimal play here, again, getting rid of this option now to steal Luke's idol, giving Luke a lot more leverage in the game as well, where ultimately, again, yes, it buys trust with Luke, but I do feel like it's a spot here where I just think the other path was just a much more clear-cut path to the end. Though again, I do find it funny how she again rips it in half and proceeds to give him half of it, to which we never see him actually read the parchment, where if he did, he would probably find out the actual rules of the advantage, which is that he essentially did all this for nothing, as Parvati couldn't play the advantage when he thought she could anyway. But again, it does lead to Luke really gloating confessional about how there was zero logic for her to be doing this, which, yeah, I agree. But anyway, we get the tribal where, again, it's pretty clear cut, where we get talk about this new majority that's formed, and Parvati still seems to be hung up on Lisa trying to blindside her, with all this just being very pointless. And we do get Luke still pushing against Lisa, which is probably not the greatest jury management there. And we hear lots of talk about just wanting to get to the end and being okay with going to the end with the 4, which is just boring, and it leads to an easy 5-1 Lisa vote, where I also do question what was Shawnee doing through all this. I guess just banking on the Australians sticking with her at 5. But yeah, I do find it humorous that Lisa ends up leaving the game here just so giddy over having played with Suri, more so than being upset at her being voted out. But again, we lose Lisa, and I very much like Lisa in her first appearance, again, kind of being this like stereotypical super fan that went on the show and played a very impressive game and came back here. And again, I know a lot of people were very frustrated with Lisa by the end. A lot of people were upset at her for wanting to quit the game. A lot of people were frustrated at how she handled that previous round, though again, I think Lisa's just a very rational person that kind of recognized that, yeah, I can't win the game at this point, so I might as well just try to make my ideal situation happen, which is either Tommy or Suri winning. And again, I don't really fault her too much for wanting to quit the game. I fully get why she would want to do that in that position. And I do think she gave a valiant effort here. I do think she made logical arguments on her way out. Just again, it just seemed like Parvati was very gung-ho against her either way. And again, that 4-person alliance was just sticking strong to where, again, I feel like as a whole, this actually doesn't really lessen my opinion of Lisa as a player. I feel like I already felt like Lisa had some, again, strategic missteps her first time around. I feel like nothing we saw here really changes my opinion of her game to where ultimately, again, I do think she's someone that is still very skilled for the game, definitely has a very strategic mind for the game, yet, again, definitely has some missteps here and there that end up being some holes for her game as well. But now for episode 9, which ends up being a lot more of the same from last time, though, again, I guess slightly better, considering it felt like a move was at least a bit more realistic here. But we once again get the setup of the 4-person alliance with Shawnee on the outs, with Parvati saying it's the last time she can play her idol and plans on using it to protect Suri. Need to rewrite history and get to the end with Suri 17 years later, which with that I will question, why do you want to rewrite history? You won the season and you would have potentially lost if Suri was there, so I don't know why you want to rewrite that. Either way, we see Luke and Janine also reaffirming their relationship, with Janine saying that she would never vote him out unless it was him or her, though does also talk about how she would be okay with going to the final 3 if Parvati and Suri, and really at this point, Janine is in a very strong position, specifically if this alliance were to go to the 4, where it really sets her up as a swing in most scenarios, and even in the world where like Luke wins immunity, which is the worst case scenario, she at least has a chance at fire at that point, to where, though again, this is obviously just here to set up this dilemma for her to following around, even though again, it didn't really feel like a real dilemma. It felt pretty clear she was going to side with Luke by the end, but either way, we did get lots of talk here about just needing to get to the end, where again, just continuing the frustration of how players just seem to be playing to get to the end over making sure that they can win, where again, Janine positioned herself very well to get to the end, but just wasn't likely to beat anybody, though again, I think biases definitely came into play in terms of that. But again, we do see Luke and Janine once again saying we need to stick with a simple Shawnee vote for whatever reason, really wasting the Aussie majority, though says that the backup would be getting Shawnee to take out Suri, which, if anything, I think actually plan should be trying to trick Parvati into playing the idol on Suri, and then you vote for Parvati instead, but whatever. And this is all while Shawnee thinks that she's in the middle and thinks that she's a swing, when obviously the reality is that she's just an easy consensus boot. Seemingly, again, having actively tried to get into this position, not realizing how unbreakable this 4-person alliance is. Or again, you would think that the Aussies would stick with her, but they don't. And even then, we do see her branching out to Suri and Parvati, trying to get them to turn on Janine, with us getting this like segment that was very strange in her, like talking to Janine about her company Boost, and it really is shown as if like Shawnee's like goading her into talking about how successful she is, to prop her up as a threat, talking about how she's a keynote speaker and does it for fun. Is that somebody you would want in the final 3? When it's like, kind of, when they can't win the game anyway. Anyway, we get to the immunity challenge, it being a big obstacle course here that culminates in a stacking portion, with Luke really being in the lead the entire time. And Shawnee actually puts up a pretty good performance here until the monkey fist portion, where she struggles to land it there, to which we do actually get a pretty funny moment here of her campaigning to Parvati mid-challenge. Though again, Luke ends up pulling out the win once again, giving him the necklace and the idol at the final time that he can use it, to where he talks about how he can make a crazy move that he just won't do. But anyway, the alliance here obviously agrees to vote out Shawnee, but we do see them worry about Luke playing the idol, only for Janine to not believe he has an idol, which I will say with that, it's kind of insane that he never tells Janine about this idol, yet he decided to tell Parvati about it, to where he just continues to lie about it here, which is so strange. Especially considering, like, again, you're banking on Janine being this number for you at 4. Why are you just continuing to lie to her? Either way, Luke then proceeds to also lie to Parvati here, saying that he never had an idol and was just using it to build trust, with Parvati saying, well, you tricked me, you little trickster. Where, again, this is all just such weird play, because, like, either way, this is now Luke essentially just telling her, hey, I lied to you, whether that's now when you're lying about not having an idol, or when you lied to her before about having an idol. Either way, you're saying I lied to you in a spot where you're banking on her trusting you at this point. But either way, we see Shawnee now shifting her campaign to now take out Suri to Janine, but clearly sees that they aren't buying what she's selling, though does think that Luke has an idol, noticing that he barely celebrated his immunity win, to which she ends up asking him to use the idol on her, which really he should, where again, for Luke, it would be very beneficial to split up Parvati and Suri before the final 4, but who would have guessed it? He doesn't really do that. So again, it is funny that Luke, who is known for playing very chaotically and playing a very dynamic game and known for making big moves, ends up playing so conservatively here, to where despite him saying that Crazy Luke might come out tonight, Crazy Luke never comes out in this game. And it kind of feels very reminiscent to me to Natalie Anderson in Winners at War, in the spot where I think both just assumed if they got to the end, they would win. And through that, end up playing very conservative end games to the point where they just simply don't have that respect by the end to win a jury vote. Well, finally, we get some focus around Parvati telling Suri that Luke has an idol, only to be confused over how Janine doesn't know that, which again, I am too. Which leads to Suri being worried that the Australians might be working together, and says that if the tables were turned, she would be trying to keep the world numbers, which makes me question, why didn't you do that last round? But this ends up leading to Shawnee pitching to her, specifically calling out the fact that if Suri goes to Final Four of this group, that she's going to fire. And what do you know? For again, Suri does seem to recognize this to a degree and talks about how this proposition is attractive, but doesn't do anything about it. Again, just going back to wanting to take Janine to the end with her in a spot where, again, credit Janine for fully tricking Suri in this position. But it does lead into Tribal, where we do get some shenanigans here with Parvati pulling out her idol, saying it's for her or Suri, all while Luke ends up pulling over Janine, asks her to promise him that she would let him go to fire no matter what, which Janine says never in doubt, to which he then hands her his immunity necklace, and then pulls out his own idol, which he proceeds to say that he's going to play it for himself or Shawnee, which I will say also, very dumb that he's doing this when he's not actually going to go through with this move. Why? Again, just further upset Parvati and Suri in this situation. Now, ultimately, it doesn't matter, as again, Luke is safe no matter what if he plays the idol on himself. And realistically, this is a position where this is a near advantage again in situation where really it is only Suri and Shawnee that could potentially go home if the idols are played on the players that have them, to where there really are not many options here. Yeah, I just feel like this was a play here that just felt so unnecessary if you weren't going to go through with it. It really just feels like Luke trying to make it seem like he's willing to make a big move and trying to show people that, oh, I could have made a big move, but then just not actually do it, which actually to me feels worse. And this is all while we have Suri talking about how they're trying to play the game different and show the world that in a game of lies and deceit that you can make it to the end through honesty and loyalty, which felt like complete bullshit. To which, again, I don't know how intentional she necessarily was in this, but obviously, again, good to sell this to Luke as a reason to not make this move. Though, again, because of all the advantages in play at this point, Shawnee ends up voting for Suri, feeling forced to. All the rest end up voting for Shawnee, with Luke deciding to not play his idol for her. Though we do get a very interesting moment as the idols are getting played here, of both Parvati and Luke getting up at the same time and proceeding to essentially have this tug of war of who's going to be playing their idol first, and neither wanting to say who they're playing their idol for, which is a very interesting moment. Actually, again, very reminiscent of Heroes of Villains, and this is like essentially the story that Russell told the heroes of what happened between him and Parvati in their fake story, but again, it's actually real this time, though we do see Parvati brokering a deal here that I thought was very good play here from Parvati, and having them play the idols for each other, essentially getting Luke to play his idol first also in that, which allows her to counter it in the case that Luke tries to pull a fast one. Ultimately, again, it leads to both idols being played unsuccessfully, and Shawnee ends up going home in a 4-1 vote with her theme song playing as she leaves. It's her saying that she's hanging up her red dress, but she's coming for JLP's job, which is such a bizarre confessional to keep in the show when obviously JLP did get his job taken by David. But either way, Shawnee, and sadly, I do feel like this is a rather lackluster appearance from Shawnee in a spot where we were promised a lot more, where again, following the spoiler community, this was a position where Shawnee was spoiled as the Final 5 boot, but was spoiled as someone that was taken out due to an advantage get-in situation, and played her best game yet, and was kind of robbed in this position when that's not really what happened. Like, obviously, yeah, it was a near advantage get-in situation where only 2 people could really be voted for, but it was also a position where she was going home anyway, and ultimately, again, I feel like she plays a rather lackluster game on this season, to where while I get what she was trying to do and I get how she was operating in the game, I do think how she was operating the game was not particularly effective, and she really spends the majority of the game on the bottom. And to be fair, again, she does come into the game with very few connections that definitely did not help her on the Australia tribe, at least. But I do think it's a spot here where I actually do think Shawnee played a fairly lackluster game here, which is so disappointing considering what we were told coming into this season. But despite that, again, Shawnee's still Shawnee. She still has fun confessionals. She's still an interesting player, though, again, just not the greatest appearance from her by the end. But with that, we now finally move on to the finale, which was essentially just a coronation where obviously Parvati was going to win, and there wasn't really any doubt here. Anyway, we start the finale with typical reflective confessionals at the start, with Janine just being entirely missing from the intro, which I found very funny. Though Parvati ends up re-bringing up this being a full circle moment for her coming back after losing to a bitter jury and reclaiming her crown, where again, I wonder if she'll do that. But she's also so happy that she's here for Survivor soulmate in Suri, and I'm sure nothing will split them up here. Oh, Parvati says it's do or die, and if she doesn't win, she'll be sent packing, which based on her game view, I don't know why she thought this, as again, she seemed to think Janine was with her, so I don't know why she thought she would be voted out here, even though again, she actually was likely correct that she was at least going to go in fire had she not won immunity here. But again, we do see her talking about how she needs to keep Suri here too, because again, she'll surely be able to do that. And this is all while we see Suri being worried about sitting next to Luke at the end, where really you should be worried about sitting next to Parvati at the end. But again, both Parvati and Suri here are just seemingly very openly just wanting to get to the end together, in a spot where I did think this is a negative really for both of them, where I think they probably more handily win against both Luke and Janine. Now, obviously, this is a much bigger negative for Suri, as I do think Parvati would beat Suri. However, unlike in other situations where we see this happen, I don't think Parvati's done a lot of this work intentionally to beat Suri at the end. I think she just happens to beat Suri at the end. Well, while I don't think that's necessarily a criticism of her game on this season, I do think it is something that I always will go back to as one of the reasons why I don't have as much faith in Parvati in the grand scheme of things, just due to the fact that she is seemingly just loyal to a fault to the people that she is truly loyal to. But either way, we have Luke here talking about how he's in the same position he was 5 years ago, and it's full circle for him, even though it shouldn't be, considering again, you're gonna lose at the end. Though again, fully thinks that he's gonna win here, and talks about having played a game based on relationships instead of crazy moves. When it's like, yeah, you probably should have played the other way. Either way, it takes us to final immunity, it being again the typical final Australian Survivor immunity challenge of you having to stand on pegs while holding on to weights on the side, similar to the final immunity challenge and it plays out pretty expectedly, with Suri being the first to drop. Shocking. So I was a little bit surprised at Janine being the second here, though either way, it doesn't really matter. There was no doubt that Parvati was going to win this challenge, with Luke yelling out in pain throughout the entire back portion of it, to where we'd even see Suri really rooting Parvati on, where it's like, again, you shouldn't be. But again, Parvati wins final immunity, and again, the game. So again, everything's as expected. But again, Parvati says she needs to get Suri to the final 3, both seemingly confident that they have Janine on their side, where again, very impressive from Janine, the fact that she kept Parvati and Suri loyal to her in a spot where obviously they could have voted for Janine. And this was a spot where Janine admits herself that if she were to go in fire, she thinks she loses to Suri. So again, for her to actively keep herself safe here by keeping the votes off of her and onto Luke, I think is very impressive play here from Janine. Though again, a lot of the setup leading in the tribal is this dilemma for Janine on, is she gonna let Luke go to fire, where she clearly was, where we get the tribal, where we do get some boring sentimental content leading into the vote, though it obviously ends up being a 2v2 with Suri and Luke going to fire, and Luke actually underperforming here, despite the fact that he does ultimately win. He ends up making a fire early, but his structure keeps on falling, to where we do actually see Suri getting a fire going, to where again, at least some improvement there, though again, still loses, which is not a great sign for her fire making abilities coming into Survivor 50. But again, Suri ends up leaving the game here, saying she thinks Luke will win, but wants Parvati to, where again, I really don't get why the players in the game really thought Luke was going to win this jury vote, considering it's not even like the majority of the jury is Australian either. So even if there was this national pride in the jury, the majority of the jury is not even Australian anyway, to where again, I really don't understand where this notion really came from. But again, with that, we do lose Suri, and again, I just felt like this was a bit of a lacking outcome for Suri's game, to where, again, she's at least in another spot where she didn't get taken out by a straight up vote, but against a position where I just feel like Suri could have played this endgame so much better. And the thing is, like, I feel like Suri is playing such a great game for the first, like, 2/3 of the game, but then by the time the final 8, it feels like she kind of just, like, lets go of her game to just go to the end of Parvati in a spot where Parvati will beat her, and I feel like that's, again, just so lacking for someone on high of a caliber as Suri, to where I get there's this obviously pregame allegiances in play, but again, I was pretty disappointed to see Suri not really take initiative here and try to get the win for herself and actively go into a Final Four situation where she was very likely going to lose in fire. And I also felt like she was kind of being tricked into doing some things at points, and again, didn't have the greatest read on the game at points, where again, I think this was a weird appearance from Suri. It doesn't really lower my opinion of Suri as a player that much, though I think this just further proves why a player like Parvati is just a better player than Suri, in that Suri just has too many faults in things outside of the social strategy aspects of the game to make her path to the end a lot harder than someone like Parvati, who has, again, final immunity to fall back on. I assume is probably a better fire maker and has that to fall back on, where again, I just feel like Suri is someone that just doesn't really have those tools to get to the very end of the game, and I feel like that is really my main takeaway from this season, to where again, I still think Suri is obviously the best to never win. She's still one of the best players of all time. Though I did feel like this was kind of a disappointing run from her, despite the fact that it did start off fairly strong. But with that, we're now at the final 3. And again, there's no real doubt here. Parvati's obviously going to win this. Though we do see Parvati being devastated that Suri's out of the game, but does talk about how she did everything she can to prove she's the best of all time and played her most flawless game, which, fair. Again, still flawed, but I mean, yeah, again, it is her most flawless game. Where we then proceed to get very little Luke focus leading the tribal, instead get more focus on Janine, talking about how she's going to win like she does in business and has the emotional intelligence to read the room, which certainly isn't a setup for a fall. Where we do get the final tribal, where Janine is the first to give her speech, talking about playing with loyalty and trust. And it was very clear while she was speaking that the jury just simply did not really care that much about what she was saying. And I also found it very strange that she talked about how her biggest move in the game was causing the tie at Final 4, which it's like, no, the biggest move in the game should have been your connection to Parvati and Suri. You causing the tie at 4 was actually kind of dumb from a gameplay perspective, where I think you actually probably had better odds of having Parvati and Suri split votes than you getting votes against Luke. And then weirdly also proceeds to say that she played a flawless game, despite the fact that she also talked about how her game wasn't going well at the merge, which again just made this a very confusing pitch. To where again, it just felt pretty clear that Janine was never going to win this. Though I didn't love Sarah's jury question here, which it felt like her being on a bit of a high horse here, calling out Janine for not being loyal to her and stoking the flames and being the real reason the Aussies broke up because she told Kirby Sarah was after her. With Janine saying it was important for Kirby to know, only for Sarah to constantly say, not then though. Which again, just felt very dumb. Just felt like Kirby and Sarah trying to pass off blame to anyone else other than themselves for their own decisions. And this is all we see Luke go for a more sympathetic pitch here, talking about his story of getting on the show, and tries to get credit for getting Parvati to rip up her advantage, even though, again, he did nothing with that. To where, again, I think the notion of him getting Parvati to rip up the advantage is an impressive move. The problem is that he just did nothing to actually benefit his game from doing that, where again the point of that is to then eventually try to take Parvati out, but again for you to get her to rip up her advantage just to go to the end with her again doesn't really do anything. And again we proceed to see him getting called out here, saying that he wanted to work with the world, also talking about how he was Aussie strong, leading to them saying, well then why would we work with you if you were Aussie strong, which is again fair. Always see Parvati have a fairly flawless final tribal performance, admitting to her faults, but still being very effective in selling her game, revealing her bluff with her knowledge is power, which gets a big reaction there, and using it to prop up how it got Luke to reveal his idol to her. Also talking up how she never had her name written down, which again, I mentioned before, doesn't really mean anything, but again, good talking point at least. Again, just very clear Parvati is winning this, and I feel like she doesn't really stumble at the finish line here, to where we get to the vote itself, where we do have Sarah voting for Luke here, saying that he is the greatest of all time, aka a friend of mine that I wanted to give the win. Always see Sri voting for Parvati, saying that's because she's the best Survivor player in the world. I do find it funny how, like, it seemed like this criteria on this season shifted towards the end, where they kept on talking about how the winner of this season is the greatest of all time. When it's like, are they? Like, would I really be calling Luke or Janine the greatest Survivor player of all time if they won this season? Like, I don't even think they would be in the conversation. But either way, Parvati obviously wins this in a 6-1 vote, getting every vote except for Sarah, being, again, a very dominant performance here, and a very satisfying conclusion to A vs. the World, where while I obviously have criticisms of Parvati's game on this season, I do still think Parvati played an extremely impressive game, played a very dominant game from beginning to end. Now, again, I wish she had a bit more push at points and got her way at more points, though ultimately, again, it is a game that's not that far apart from Tony's Winners at War game. Again, playing against a lot of tough competition and being able to maintain a solid position throughout most of the season. Now, again, I think there are differences there, especially in like how unlucky Tony got in the end game that caused him to have a bit of a rockier end game. While also, again, I think Parvati is some of that probably was more stably in a power position than Tony was throughout more of that season. But again, I think in terms of caliber of winning game there, I think they're around the same level. It's where, again, I think this was a very impressive performance from Parvati. Definitely one of the best winning games of all time. Though, again, not flawless, but still a very satisfying conclusion for A vs. the World, where, again, I do think if Luke or Janine were to win this season, it would have been a very lame outcome. I think for it to actually be someone that, again, is in serious conversation for the best player of all time at this point, I think is, again, a satisfying way for this to go, especially when, again, it pays off so much with Parvati's storyline. Again, her finally getting her win in Samoa, as she constantly reiterates, her also getting her second win. So I think coming into this season, thinking up of some of the better outcomes for a season, I think Parvati winning this season definitely would have been one of those, where, again, overall, I think definitely adds to the appeal of this season, even though, again, it was a fairly rough endgame stretch to get to this point. But again, with that, that's the entire season. Before we wrap up the video, though, I do want to talk about the finalists, starting it off with Janine. And Janine's a player here that I actually felt pretty impressed by the end here. I feel like Janine's someone that I actually feel like was probably one of the most integral players to how this game played out. I think she did a lot of good legwork with Parvati and Suri, was able to get them to want to take Luke to the end, and was stably able to get her to the final 3. The problem is that I don't think she could win the game. And again, I think there's a lot of factors playing into that. The fact that she's already this rich businesswoman that I don't think people think needs the win. And again, she actively goes to the end against people who are perceived as bigger threats, though I do think Janine plays this season fairly well, where as a whole, I feel like my opinion of Janine as a player did go up through this in a spot where I was not actually expecting much of Janine coming into this season. And again, I think she kind of surpassed my expectations. We then cut to Luke, who I was not particularly excited to see on this season, where while Luke can be fun TV, I don't particularly like Luke things outside the show, and I'm at least happy that he did not end up winning this season, as again, I would have been not particularly happy if that results, though again, Luke on this season just felt like a bit of a shell of his previous self, again, to where while he did actually get to the end this time, it was playing a rather lackluster game and being on the bottom for a lot of it, even in positions where he finally had a bit of agency in the game. He decides to just go to the end with Parvati and Suri and play it safe, and again, it's just a very lame game here. I think it's one where he doesn't really do anything to warrant gaining respect from the jury, and the fact that the only jury vote he gets by the end is a friend of his that he's had for years, again, is just kind of representative of his game, where there's nothing he did in the game that really warrants him getting jury votes over Parvati. And I feel like he just plays a game here where he just plays it so safe with the assumption that he would win, not understanding that he can't just win all the time just based on who he is as a person. Where, again, I think it's a spot here where I think Luke plays his endgame all wrong, and to be fair, I was kind of happy for it, as again, I didn't want him to win anyway. And with that, we then move on to Parvati, who I've already said my piece on Parvati on this season. Again, I think she played a very strong game, not a flawless game, but definitely overall, I think improved my opinion of her as a player, obviously getting her second win here, obviously playing a more developed version of her previous games, again, still having that charisma that we saw from back in the day, but also playing a very active strategic game, utilizing her advantages fairly well. And while again, I still have faults with her killer instinct in the game, I still don't love this aspect of her being so blindly loyal to Suri. I do feel like it's a spot here where Parvati is in serious contention as the greatest of all time. Now, I already talked about in my player ranking why I personally would have Tony still above Parvati at this point, though I think Parvati is someone that I do think is probably more consistent in the game. I think Parvati is someone that would make it deeper into the game on more given seasons. However, again, I think in terms of strategic decision making, I do have a little bit more faith in Tony in terms of the decisions that he makes. Though again, Parvati's still very impressive player. I think the definitive number 2 for me, where I think at this point it's like far and away Tony and Parvati as a top 2, and not really much of a debate on anyone else being in that conversation. Though again, criticism I have of the season though with Parvati is the fact that again, it was just so obvious Parvati was going to win from the editing of it all. Again, the fact that Parvati just got most confessionals on the season by a pretty wide margin, which to be fair is not always end all be all on Australian Survivor, but I think with this being A vs the World and the fact that you would think they would give a coronation edit to whoever won this season, again, it made it so much more apparent that Parvati were to win this season, especially when you have people like, again, Janine, who had a fairly lacking beginning to her season, and Luke, who had a fairly shallow premiere episode. And again, it just feels like a spot here where Parvati was so obviously winning from very early on that makes the endgame a bit boring, but ultimately, again, a very satisfying win from a storytelling perspective, at least. And with that, again, that is the entire season of A vs the World. A season that, again, I thought was a good season by the end. Again, it's a season that just feels like a lot of fan service for Survivor fans. Or again, someone like me who has watched all these people play Survivor before, again, seeing them all on a season together, again, this clash of all these different Survivor worlds was just, again, very surreal to see. Again, seeing the likes of Parvati, Suri, playing with the likes of Shawnee and Kirby and Luke is still kind of insane to wrap my head around. To where, again, just from a fan service perspective, I think this season has a lot to offer. Now, I do think in the grand scheme of things, I don't know if this season really lives up to the best of the best Survivor seasons. It doesn't really have that big landmark moment that would make it stand out amongst, again, the greatest seasons of all time. While, again, we had some pretty good rounds like the David boot round, the Kirby boot round, Cass's elimination, I don't feel like this season had this like all-time great vote off within it. Though I do think there are a lot of comparisons between this and Winners at War, particularly in how satisfying the conclusions of the seasons are, how much they embrace the history of the series. And while, again, I personally have more attachment to Winners at War than this season. I do think this season, again, definitely has a lot to offer, even though, again, I was a bit underwhelmed with how the last few episodes played out, but it was still a strong season despite that. And if I had to rank it amongst the AU seasons, again, it's amongst the best. I would not say it's better than Titans vs. Rebels, probably not better than 2017, though I would say it's like in the conversation following that. It's definitely a solid season, though definitely there are other seasons that had higher high points. But again, with that, those are my opinions on Australian Survivor versus the World. Now, again, obviously this review is coming out very late, and sadly, again, that's kind of just the way things are at this point where I'm very far behind on videos. But again, with this out now, I will be jumping immediately into working on my Big Brother 27 content, to where I will say probably expect that content to be fairly similar to this, and I'll probably try to get my player ranking out immediately, and then we'll just see when the review comes out, because I doubt I'll have it done in time. But again, we'll see. Now, beyond that, in terms of the Australian Survivor sphere, I always did intend on making a ranking of every Australian Survivor player. Initially, it was going to be after Brains Bond 2, but then after we knew A vs. the World was happening, obviously I waited until this. So again, I'll be doing that at some point between now and the next season. Again, I need to actually make it, and considering how far behind I'm on videos, I'm not 100% locked in on when exactly that'll be coming out. But again, I will have that out at some point in the next few months, so stay tuned for that. Outside of that, obviously just expect more of the same style of content from the channel. But again, that wraps up my coverage of Australian Survivor versus the World. Thank you for watching.
Sorry for all the things I've said and did, but I'm not sorry for loving Nutri-Grain bars. But maybe I'm not sorry at all.